Somewhere in a mansion with 43 rooms, a little girl sat alone in the dark, pressing her knees to her chest while thunder rattled the windows. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't cried. She hadn't done much of anything in 2 years. 5 years old, and already the world had taught her that voices don't matter. That one night on a wet highway is enough to erase everything warm you've ever known. Her father was 3 floors up, staring at spreadsheets he couldn't read anymore. And a woman who had lost just as much, maybe more, was mopping a hallway she hadn't been paid enough to mop, wondering how her life had collapsed so completely that this was what survival looked like. None of them knew that tonight, everything was about to break open. If this is your first time here, stay with me. Hit that like button, drop your city in the comments, and let's see how far this story travels. The estate didn't look like a home anymore. It had been designed to, back when the architects were hired, back when the woman who commissioned it wanted French limestone and wide conservatory windows, and a garden where a child could run barefoot through wet grass without anyone worrying about the perimeter fencing. Back when there was a woman who had opinions about window light and garden soil and which rooms deserved color. Now it just looked like money. 43 rooms, 11 bathrooms, a chef's kitchen that produced meals eaten alone, a conservatory full of plants that a rotating staff of groundskeepers kept alive because no one had thought to cancel the service. Security cameras on every corner, every hallway, every staircase. 47 feeds that streamed to a monitor bank in the home office where Ethan Calloway spent most of his nights. Not because he was watching them, but because the alternative was silence. He was 32 years old, and he looked 45. Not in the soft, distinguished way that money sometimes ages powerful men. The silver temple, strong jaw kind of aging that business magazines photograph for cover stories. Ethan Calloway had aged the way exhaustion ages people, the way guilt does. There were shadows under his eyes that no amount of sleep had touched in 26 months, because sleep itself had become a negotiation, a thing he had to bargain his way into with 2 glasses of scotch, and the white noise machine his therapist had recommended 14 months ago, right before he stopped seeing his therapist. He was sitting at his desk now, at 11:40 on a Tuesday night, with a half-finished glass of Glenlivet, beside a report he was supposed to have read 3 days ago. The report was about quarterly projections for the software division. It was 112 pages long. He was on page 4. Outside, the storm had been building for an hour. The kind of late October storm that came in off the Atlantic and sat over the Hudson Valley like it owned the place. Rain against the windows, wind through the old oaks that lined the east side of the property, and underneath all of it, the low, continuous silence of a house where a child had stopped making noise. That was the thing people didn't understand when they asked. And people asked carefully, obliquely, in the sideways manner of those who knew better than to push a man like Ethan Calloway directly, about Sophie. They assumed the silence was metaphorical. A quiet child. A shy child. A child who had been through something terrible and needed time. The silence was not metaphorical. Sophie Calloway had not spoken a single word since the night of the accident. Not one. Not yes, or no, or dad, or any of the other words a 5-year-old collects like smooth stones. She communicated in gestures, a pointed finger, a head shake, the particular way she went still when she wanted to disappear. But even those had become rare over the months. The specialists called it selective mutism with traumatic etiology, which was a clinical way of saying that something had broken in the child's willingness to speak, and nobody had been able to fix it yet. They had tried. God, they had tried. 6 different therapists, 4 of them specialists in childhood trauma. One of them, a woman who had written 2 books on the subject and charged $1,200 an hour. A speech-language pathologist who drove up from the city twice a week for 8 months. Art therapy. Music therapy. A brief ill-advised experiment with equine therapy that had ended when Sophie refused to leave the car. 2 different pediatric psychiatrists and a consultation with a child neurologist who confirmed, reassuringly, that there was nothing physiologically wrong with Sophie's vocal cords or her hearing or her brain, that the silence was entirely, stubbornly psychological. Money, it turned out, was not the variable that fixed a broken child. Ethan had not fully processed this yet. He was still, on some level, waiting for the right invoice, the one that would arrive with the solution attached. He was still, on some level, a man who believed that sufficient resources applied to a sufficient problem produced a sufficient result. That belief had built him an empire. It had also, he suspected in the honest moments at 2 in the morning, turned him into someone his wife would not entirely recognize. Rebecca had recognized things he couldn't see. That was the part he kept coming back to, in the sideways, oblique manner he himself used to think about things he couldn't bear to look at directly. Rebecca had always seen the actual problem, not the problem he was performing anxiety about. She would have known what Sophie needed. She would have known which approach, which person, which angle. She had been catastrophically, infuriatingly perceptive about human beings, and Ethan had spent their 7 years of marriage being alternately grateful for it and annoyed by it. And now he would have given every company he owned to have her sit across from him and tell him what he was missing. But Rebecca was gone. And Sophie was 3 floors down, alone in her room with the storm outside, and Ethan was on page 4 of a report about quarterly projections. He turned to page 5. Claire Dawson had a system. You develop systems when the alternative is thinking. You develop systems when your apartment is 340 square feet and your bank account has $212 in it, and you have spent the last 18 months relearning how to get through a Tuesday. You develop systems because systems are manageable, and the rest of it is not. Her system for the 3rd floor east corridor: start at the window end, work toward the staircase, keep the mop strokes even. Don't let the bucket water go gray before you change it. 15 minutes, maybe 20 if the mahogany needed extra attention around the baseboard heating units. Then the linen closet audit. Then the silver frames on the side table that nobody looked at. Then down to the 2nd floor. She'd been working at the Callaway estate for 4 months, hired through an agency that placed domestic staff in large homes in the tri-state area. The kind of agency that asked for references and ran background checks and prided itself on discretion, which was a word wealthy people used when they meant we need staff who won't talk. Claire had 3 good references from previous positions: a family in Westchester, a retired couple in Connecticut, a woman in Manhattan who collected antique maps, and she had passed the background check because her background was technically clean. The license revocation didn't show up as a criminal matter. It was a professional matter, a board matter, the kind of thing that disappeared into the institutional paperwork of a world that had already decided she didn't belong in it anymore. She was 30 years old and she felt 60. Not in the way exhaustion does, though there was exhaustion, always, the kind that doesn't go away with sleep because it's not about sleep. It was more like the particular weight of a person who had been compressed, a person who had been, at one point, larger, who had taken up more space in the world, had projected into the future, had made plans that assumed a future worth planning for, and who had since been reduced to the exact dimensions of what she absolutely could not afford to lose: the job, the apartment, the system. Daniel was everywhere she wasn't looking directly, in the periphery, in the way rain sounded on windows, in the particular silence after a storm shifted direction and you suddenly became aware of everything that wasn't there. 2 years, and she still couldn't watch people drive away in cars without something tightening in her chest. She wrung out the mop and moved it in even strokes across the mahogany floor. From somewhere below, the thunder hit, a deep, resonant crack that shook the windows in their frames and made the lights flicker once, twice, and then die completely. Claire stood still in the sudden darkness, mop in hand, while her eyes adjusted. Okay, she thought, okay. She had learned in the last 2 years that her nervous system reacted to things before her brain caught up. Loud sounds, sudden darkness, the smell of burning rubber or gasoline. Her heart had already jumped before she could tell herself that this was just a power outage. This was just a storm. This was just a house with 43 rooms and a generator that would kick on in 30 seconds. She counted. The generator kicked on in 22 seconds. The lights came back, dimmer than before. The estate running on backup power, the emergency lighting giving everything a slightly yellow cast. Claire exhaled. She noticed she'd been holding the mop handle hard enough that her knuckles had gone white, and she made herself loosen her grip one finger at a time. And then she heard it. From below, from the ground floor, from the direction of the glass conservatory that jutted off the south side of the house, and that she had never seen anyone actually use. She heard a child crying. Not screaming, not the dramatic performance crying of a child who wants something, the quiet kind. The kind that happens when a child has decided that nobody is coming anyway, so there's no point making it loud. Claire stood at the top of the staircase and listened. She knew she was not the person employed to handle this. There was a nighttime nanny, Mrs. Pendleton, a brisk 60-year-old from Yorkshire who managed Sophie's mornings and bedtimes and who was currently, presumably, off duty in the staff quarters. There was a system for this. There was a chain of people who handled the child, and Claire was nowhere on that chain. She was, in the household's invisible hierarchy, the woman who mopped floors and polished frames and stayed out of the way. She went down the stairs anyway. The conservatory was cold. The heating system ran off the main power, not the generator, which meant that the glass room with its floor-to-ceiling windows and its jungle of tropical plants had dropped noticeably in temperature when the power went out. Sophie was sitting on the stone floor with her back against a large terracotta pot that held something with broad dark leaves, knees pulled to her chest, face turned toward the windows where the rain was hitting the glass in sheets. She wasn't crying anymore. She'd stopped when Claire's footsteps came down the hall. Claire had heard the shift, the sudden cessation, the way the child had decided to be very still and very small, like an animal that's learned that being noticed has consequences. Claire stopped in the doorway. She did not say it's okay or don't be scared or I'm here now, all the things adults say to frighten children that are technically untrue and that frightened children can detect the falseness of immediately. She didn't say anything. She just stood in the doorway for a moment, letting Sophie look at her, letting the child run whatever calculation a 5-year-old runs when an unfamiliar adult shows up in the dark. Then Claire sat down on the floor. Not next to Sophie. That would have been too close, too fast. She sat maybe 8 feet away, in the middle of the conservatory floor, with her back against the opposite wall of plants. She crossed her legs. She put her hands in her lap. Outside, lightning lit up the glass walls white for a full 2 seconds, and the thunder that followed was immediate and enormous, rattling the terracotta pots and making the plant leaves shiver. Sophie flinched. A full-body flinch, the kind that starts in the shoulders and ripples down. Claire reached into the pocket of her uniform jacket. She always carried a small flashlight for the corridors after hours, part of the system, and switched it on. She angled it upward toward the white-painted ceiling of the conservatory, so it bounced back down into the room as a diffuse, soft glow. Then she held her hands up in front of the beam. The shadow on the ceiling was a rabbit. Not a great one. Claire had to think for a second, adjust her fingers, lose the ear, and find it again. But recognizably a rabbit, with its long shadow ears and its round shadow head. She made it hop. Once, twice. It turned its head. She glanced at Sophie. The child was staring at the ceiling. Claire brought her hands apart and reshaped them. This one took longer. She hadn't done this in 2 years, hadn't thought about it consciously, but her hands seemed to remember without her brain's permission. The shadow on the ceiling became a fox. Long, pointed shadow muzzle, 2 triangular ears, a tail that she made flick left, then right. From across the conservatory, Sophie Calloway made a sound. It was small. It was barely anything. A short, surprised exhale. The ghost of something that might have been a laugh if it had gotten enough air behind it. But it was a sound, and it had come from a child who did not make sounds. Claire kept going. She hadn't planned this. She had no plan. She never planned these days anything that existed more than 20 minutes into the future. But her hands were making a dog now, and the dog was chasing the fox across the ceiling while the storm hammered the glass walls. And the little girl with the dark eyes was slowly, incrementally, uncurling from the tight ball she'd made of herself. By the time Claire's arm was starting to ache from holding it at the angle the flashlight required, Sophie had crossed 2/3 of the conservatory floor and was sitting close enough that Claire could hear her breathing. The lightning came again. Another whiteout flash. And this time, instead of flinching, Sophie grabbed Claire's free hand. Not hard, just a small hand closing around Claire's fingers, holding on. And then, when Claire made the fox turn around and pretend to sneeze, she'd always been bad at the sneeze. It had never looked right. Sophie laughed. A real one. A full one. The kind of laugh that has no filter between the body and the sound. The kind children produce and adults spend their whole lives trying to get back to. It lasted maybe 4 seconds. It was the most important 4 seconds in that house in 2 years. 3 floors up, Ethan Calloway was on page 7 of the quarterly projections report when the laughing sound came through his computer speakers. He didn't register it immediately. His brain had gotten good at filtering the estate's ambient audio. The security system ran continuous audio alongside the video feeds, and over 14 months of involuntary late-night monitoring, He'd learned to hear through the background noise of a large house at night. Wind. The generator's hum. The distant, occasional sound of staff moving through corridors. Not laughter. His hand moved to the mouse before he'd consciously decided to move it. The security panel was open in a separate window. It was always open, another of his systems, and he clicked through to the conservatory camera feed. The image was grainy in the emergency lighting. He could make out the shape of his daughter, the small, hunched silhouette he recognized with a physical pain he still had no language for, and a woman sitting on the floor across from her. One of the cleaning staff by the uniform jacket, and a flashlight beam angled at the ceiling and shadows moving on it, and his daughter. His daughter was laughing. Ethan sat very still. He had not heard that sound in 26 months. He had not. This was the thing he could not say to anyone, the thing that sat at the absolute bottom of the pile of things he could not say. He had started to wonder, in the worst moments, whether he would ever hear it again, whether whatever had been injured inside Sophie was the kind of thing that healed or the kind of thing that just became the new shape of a person. He watched the feed. The woman on the floor had her hands up, making shadow shapes on the ceiling. He couldn't make out the details at this resolution, but he could see the general forms, animal shapes, the kind you make with your hands when you're a child or when you want to calm a child. Sophie was close to her now, much closer than she'd started. He could see that Sophie was holding the woman's free hand. He watched until the laughing stopped, until Sophie's posture changed, until it was clear his daughter had fallen asleep right there on the conservatory floor with her head tilted against the stranger's arm. Then Ethan Calloway sat back in his chair and did something he hadn't done in 26 months either. He put his face in his hands and stayed that way for a long time. He would have left it alone if it had been just the laughter. The laughter was extraordinary, yes. The laughter was a thing he could not fully absorb in one sitting, the way you can't absorb certain news all at once, and instead have to keep returning to it in pieces. But laughter, by itself, he could have explained. A child who finds the right person at the right moment. A natural breakthrough that the specialists had told him, repeatedly, would come eventually through no particular intervention, that Sophie would find her voice again when she was ready, when something or someone made the conditions right. He could have left it at that. But the shadow puppets. He'd lain awake most of the night, returning to the image from the security feed, his daughter's face turned up toward those ceiling shadows, and feeling the low, wrong vibration of something he couldn't name. And at some point around 3 a.m, the word had surfaced. How? How did this woman know to do that? The shadow puppet game had been Rebecca's. Entirely hers. She had invented it, or claimed to have invented it, one evening when Sophie was 2 and they'd lost power in a thunderstorm not unlike last night's. Rebecca had grabbed a flashlight and started making shapes on the wall, and Sophie had been transfixed, and from that point on, the game belonged to storms. It was the thunderstorm game. Every time the power went out, every time the sky went dark and loud, Rebecca would find the nearest flashlight and put her hands in the air. Rebecca had never shown it to anyone else. Ethan was certain of this, or as certain as a person can be about another person's certainties, because he remembered the particular private quality of it. The way Rebecca had said once, "This is our thing, the 3 of us, I don't want to share it." So how did a housekeeper hired 4 months ago know the shadow puppet game? How did a woman named Claire Dawson, who according to her employment file had worked previously for 3 other households in the tri-state area and had no connection whatsoever to Ethan's life before last spring, walk into his conservatory in the middle of a thunderstorm and do the exact thing that only Rebecca had ever done? By 7 a.m, Ethan had the estate's head of security, Marcus Hale, on the phone. "I need everything on one of the housekeeping staff," Ethan said. "Claire Dawson. Started 4 months ago. I want her full background. I mean full, not the agency check. Employment, education, addresses, anything attached to her name in the last 5 years." Marcus had been with Ethan for 6 years, which meant he had long since stopped asking the follow-up questions that other people would have asked. "By when?" "Today. I'll have something preliminary by this afternoon." "Make it this morning," Ethan said, and hung up. The preliminary report came in at 11:15. Ethan read it standing up because he'd been too restless to sit since approximately 4 a.m, and the contents kept him standing for a different reason altogether. Claire Marie Dawson. 30 years old, born in Albany, grew up in a mid-sized town in upstate New York,
middle child of 3 in a family that the public records described as firmly working class. Academic record, strong. Undergraduate degree in biology from a state university on a partial scholarship she'd supplemented with 2 part-time jobs. Then, and here was the first thing that made Ethan's eyes stop moving, a nursing degree. Pediatric emergency nursing, certified in 2019 with, according to the licensing board's public records, an exemplary performance record, and then, as of December 2023, license revoked. Ethan flipped to the next page of the report. The reason given for the revocation was a disciplinary finding related to, and here was the language the licensing board had used, unprofessional conduct at the scene of a medical emergency resulting in potential compromise of patient outcomes and interference with emergency services. He read that sentence twice. Then he called Marcus back. I need you to pull everything you can find about a licensing board action against Claire Dawson, December 2023. And I need you to cross-reference her with... He stopped. He looked at the date on the report again, December 2023, 2 months after the accident. His throat had gone tight. He finished the sentence quietly. Cross-reference her with the accident. The highway. October 2023. The silence on Marcus's end lasted slightly too long. Ethan, do it. Another pause. I'll call you back in an hour. It took 40 minutes. Ethan was standing at the window of his home office, watching the tail end of the storm dragging itself east across his property, when Marcus called back. He picked up on the first ring. Talk to me. He listened. He did not interrupt. He listened to all of it. The incident reports, the witness statements, the insurance filings, the internal communications that Marcus had, through channels Ethan wasn't going to inquire about, managed to access. He listened while the pieces assembled themselves into a shape he'd suspected and still wasn't prepared for. Claire Dawson had been the first person on the scene. She'd been driving home on the same highway, heading north, when Ethan's company vehicle, driven by a contractor, company car, company insurance, had clipped the median barrier at high speed on a wet road and gone into the southbound lane. She had pulled over. She had gone to the car. She had climbed into the wreckage, according to the police report, through the driver's side window after it had partially deformed in the impact, to reach the passenger compartment where Sophie was strapped into her car seat. She had kept Sophie alive and conscious and as calm as possible for 11 minutes while the car burned around them. During those 11 minutes, according to the same report, she had used shadow puppets. The report didn't explain this detail. It was just there, in the clinical language of the police documentation, a detail that the officer had included because he'd interviewed Claire at the scene and she'd mentioned it. She'd used a phone flashlight and the ceiling of the car to cast shadow shapes and keep the child focused on something other than the fire and the smell and the sounds. She had learned it in those 11 minutes. She'd watched Rebecca do it, in the front seat, in the seconds before the collision. She'd seen Rebecca reach for her phone and try to make the shapes even as the car was moving, even as something was already wrong. And Claire had watched this through the driver's window from outside, and she had filed it away in the catastrophic efficiency of a nurse's mind under extreme conditions, and she had done it herself. And while she was doing it, while she was keeping Sophie alive, the second vehicle had hit her parked car. Her fiancé had been in the passenger seat. Ethan stopped Marcus there. He needed a moment. He stood at the window with the phone pressed to his ear and breathed. Keep going, he said. The cover-up was the part that took the longest to explain, not because it was complicated. It was actually straightforward in the way corporate malfeasance tends to be, which is to say motivated entirely by the simple priority of not paying, but because Marcus was careful with how he presented it. The contractor who'd been driving the company vehicle had been operating it in violation of several internal policies. The vehicle's maintenance logs had irregularities. The company's legal team had moved in the weeks following the accident to get ahead of the liability exposure, and in doing so had identified Claire Dawson as a potential complicating factor. She had been at the scene. She had spoken to police. She had a medical background, which meant her account of what she'd witnessed carried professional weight. She was also, and this was the part that made Ethan's jaw lock, a single person with no institutional backing and limited financial resources, which made her, in the cold calculation of a law firm billing $500 an hour, an addressable problem. They had gone to the nursing board. They had submitted a complaint that characterized Claire's actions at the scene as reckless, unsanctioned medical intervention that had potentially delayed proper emergency response. They had found two witnesses, Ethan did not yet know who, willing to support this characterization. The board had held hearings. Claire had been unable to afford adequate legal representation. Her license had been revoked in December 2023. The report didn't say that Ethan's executives had directed this. It said that Ethan's legal department had filed the complaint, which meant that people who worked for Ethan, people who drew salaries from Ethan's company, had taken a nurse who had crawled into a burning car to save his daughter's life and had destroyed her. "Is there more?" Ethan's voice came out level. He was proud of that, in a distant way. "That's the core of it," Marcus said. "There's more detail on the legal proceedings if you want it. Send me everything, all of it." "Ethan," Marcus paused, "you should know some of this is going to have to involve the legal team if you want to." "Send me everything," Ethan said again. "And Marcus, don't mention this to anyone else, not yet." He set the phone down on the desk and stood very still for a moment. Through the window, the last of the storm clouds were breaking apart over the eastern tree line, and the property was wet and gleaming in thin November sunlight. And somewhere on the ground floor of this house was a woman named Claire Dawson, who had crawled into a burning car to save his daughter and had her entire life dismantled as thanks. He looked at the empty glass on his desk from the previous night. He left it there and walked out of the office. He watched her for the rest of the day, not obsessively, not the way the word might imply, standing in doorways or following her through corridors. He moved through the house differently than usual, that was all, taking routes that happened to pass through the spaces where she worked. And he observed the way a person who has been running on the edge of shock tends to observe things, with a strange, flat clarity. Claire Dawson moved through the house like someone who expected to be invisible. There was a precision to how much space she occupied. Exactly the amount required for the task at hand. No more. She didn't look up when she heard footsteps. She didn't arrange her expression for the possibility of being seen. She simply worked with the focused, economical movements of someone for whom the job was the entire point, because the job was the entire structure holding everything else in place. Ethan recognized this. He'd been doing something similar for 2 years. At 2:30 in the afternoon, he turned a corner on the second floor and nearly walked into her. She stepped back immediately, a small, reflexive step, and the thing she said was sorry, automatic and without eye contact. She was carrying a stack of folded linens. There was a smudge of something on her left forearm, cleaning product or plant soil, he couldn't tell. "Claire." She looked up. Her eyes were the kind of gray-green that changes depending on the light. He noticed this because he noticed everything in the sharp, flat way of a man running on no sleep and terrible information. She was looking at him with the careful, neutral expression that domestic employees learn for interactions with the person who signs their paychecks. "Mr. Calloway," she said, polite, waiting. He had planned, over the course of the morning, several versions of this conversation. He had assembled and discarded several approaches. What came out of his mouth instead was, "How is she?" "Sophie." "Last night, was she all right after?" Something shifted in Claire's expression. The careful neutrality didn't drop exactly, but it adjusted. The way a person adjusts when a question is more human than they were prepared for. "She fell asleep," Claire said. She was okay. I covered her with my jacket and went to get Mrs. Pendleton." "Mrs. Pendleton put her to bed?" "Yes, around 2 o'clock. Ethan nodded. He was looking at the smudge on Claire's forearm because looking at her face was harder than it should have been. "Thank you," he said. "For going down there, it wasn't—" He stopped, started again. "It wasn't your responsibility."
"No," Claire agreed in a tone that wasn't cold, but wasn't warm either. Just honest. He nodded again and moved past her down the corridor, and he got around the corner before he stopped walking. He stood there with one hand on the wall and breathed carefully, the way his therapist had taught him, the way he hadn't needed in a while, the way he apparently needed right now. He had 5 conversations he needed to have, and none of them were the conversation he'd just had, and he had no idea in what order any of them were supposed to happen. That evening, for the first time in 3 months, Ethan had dinner in the actual dining room. Not at his desk, not standing in the kitchen eating from a container while checking his phone. In the dining room, at the long mahogany table that seated 22 and was usually set for 1,
with Sophie across from him in the chair that had been fitted with a booster cushion. Mrs. Pendleton brought Sophie in at 6, her dark hair brushed into two somewhat uneven pigtails. Mrs. Pendleton's attempts at Sophie's hair were sincere, if not technically accomplished, and Sophie stopped in the doorway when she saw Ethan sitting there. She stared at him. He looked at his daughter, really looked, in the way he avoided sometimes because it made something in his chest seize up. Sophie had Rebecca's eyes, the exact shape and the exact dark brown of them, and she was looking at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. Surprise. Wariness. Something else under that. Something guarded. "Hey, Bug," he said. She walked to her chair and climbed into it without help, with the focused, serious expression of a child determined not to require assistance. She straightened herself in the cushion. She looked at her plate. They ate in silence. It wasn't a comfortable silence or an uncomfortable one. It was just the particular silence that had become the baseline of their interactions, the frequency they'd settled into without either of them choosing it. Ethan asked, at one point, whether she wanted more bread, and Sophie pointed to the basket, which was as much of an answer as she generally gave. But at the end of the meal, when Mrs. Pendleton came to take her up to bed, Sophie didn't immediately climb down from her chair. She sat for a moment. Then she looked at Ethan and made a gesture with her hands. A quick, small motion, her fingers moving in a way he didn't initially recognize. He watched her do it twice before he understood that she was making the shape of an animal. A fox, maybe. 2 triangular fingers for ears, an elongated shape for a muzzle. She looked at him after, waiting. His throat closed. "Yeah," he said, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. "I know." Sophie climbed down from her chair and went with Mrs. Pendleton. Ethan sat at the long, empty table for a long time after that. At 11 that night, Ethan went down to the kitchen. He wasn't hungry. He wanted water, but really, he wanted to be somewhere other than his office, where the full report Marcus had sent sat open on his screen like a wound. He'd read it twice. He was going to read it a third time, and he needed to not do that for a few minutes. Claire was at the kitchen table. She looked up when he came in, couldn't not look up. It was a reflex. And then looked back down at what she was doing, which was writing something in a small notebook with a pen that had clearly been chewed at some point. There was a cup of tea going cold beside her. "Sorry," she said, starting to close the notebook. "I can go." "You don't have to." She stopped, stayed. Ethan got a glass of water from the tap and stood at the sink with it, looking out the kitchen window at the dark property. The storm had completely passed. The night was clear and cold and still. "Were you a nurse?" he asked. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. "No," Claire said. He turned around. She was looking at him steadily, her face doing the careful neutral thing, but her hands had gone still on the notebook. "Okay," he said. "I was a cleaner," she said. "I am a cleaner." "Claire." "Mr. Calloway." Her voice had something in it now. Not quite warning, more like the particular flatness of someone who has anticipated a conversation and armored for it. "I don't think... I know what happened," Ethan said. "Or I know most of it. I know you were at the accident. I know what you did." He stopped. His voice was not as steady as he wanted it to be. "I know what my company did to you afterward." The kitchen was very quiet. Claire looked at him for a long moment. He could see her processing it, the information he just laid out, the implications of it, the various ways this conversation could go and what each of them would cost her. He could see under the careful surface a person running very fast through a very dark place. Then she closed her notebook. "I'm going to need a minute," she said very quietly, and she stood up and walked out of the kitchen. Ethan stood at the sink with his glass of water and let her go. He heard her footsteps down the back corridor and then the sound of a door. Not slammed, just closed, firmly, and then nothing. He drank his water. He set the glass on the counter. He went back upstairs to read the report for the 3rd time. Claire didn't sleep that night. She lay in her small room in the staff wing, a room about twice the size of her apartment in the city, which was one of the reasons the live-in arrangement made financial sense, and stared at the ceiling and felt the particular quality of a night when something that has been held very carefully in place starts to slide. She had known, or suspected, or feared, These three things all lived in the same part of her chest and were difficult to separate, Tom, that it would come out eventually. You can only contain a truth for so long when you're living inside the circumstances it produced. She had taken this job because she needed any job, because she needed to stay employed, because the 2 years since the accident had stripped down her options to what she could get without the license that had been her entire professional identity. She had not known, when she applied, whose house it was. She had found out 6 weeks in. She'd seen a framed photograph in the east hallway. Ethan Calloway at some business event, the kind of photograph that gets taken when powerful men attend galas. And she'd recognized the name from the accident reports, from the insurance documentation, from the proceedings she'd been unable to stop. She had almost left that day. She had thought about it carefully, in the systematic way she thought about things now, and had decided that leaving would accomplish nothing. She needed the job. She could do the job without intersecting with the family. She could stay invisible, which she had already become quite good at. She would stay until she found something else, which she was always looking for, because this was not the life she was going to live permanently. This was the bridge, the temporary structure she was using to get from one side to the other, though she was increasingly unclear what was on the other side. But Sophie had changed the calculation, even before last night. Sophie changed the calculation the first week, actually, when Claire had seen her in the garden. Small, silent, alone, with the kind of stillness that isn't peaceful, the kind that's been learned from something difficult. Claire had watched her from the second-floor window for a few minutes, and something had pulled in her chest, and she had thought about how she would have handled this child in a clinical setting, what she would have tried, what she would have said to the parents, or the parent. She had thought, this kid needs someone who isn't scared of the silence. Most people were scared of Sophie's silence, she'd noticed. The staff moved around it carefully, spoke too loudly when they did speak, tried to fill it with noise or activity. Ethan, from what she could observe, mostly avoided it by not being in the same room. The therapist, from what she'd overheard in fragments over 4 months, kept trying to push Sophie through the silence toward speech, which was like trying to push someone through a wall that they'd built because the alternatives were worse. You had to make the silence feel safe first. And now Ethan Calloway knew who she was, or knew enough, and the careful structure she'd built was cracking, and she was lying in the dark at 12:30 in the morning, thinking about Daniel and thinking about the licensing board, and thinking about Sophie's face when the fox had sneezed on the ceiling, and none of it was organizing itself into anything she knew what to do with. She turned onto her side. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep. She found Sophie on the window of the breakfast room at 7:15, not looking out at the garden exactly, more like standing at the window with her forehead lightly touching the glass, breathing small fogs of condensation onto it, watching nothing in particular. Sophie registered Claire's presence when she came in, turned slightly, the way children do when they're not committing to a full acknowledgement, and then turned back to the window. Claire got a glass of water from the sideboard. She stood near the window too, about 4 feet from Sophie, not quite beside her, close enough to be in the same general situation without being intrusive. Outside, the grounds were still wet from the storm. The lawn had gone full autumn gold, and the remaining leaves on the far oaks were soaked dark and heavy-looking. A groundskeeper was moving across the far end of the property, doing something with a rake. After a while, without looking up from the window, Sophie put her index finger to the glass and started drawing something in the condensation fog. Careful, slow lines. A circle. 2 triangular shapes on top. A fox head. Claire watched it take shape. Then she touched her own finger to the glass, a little to the left of Sophie's drawing, and added a tail. A long, simple line with a slight curve. Sophie looked at her finger, looked at Claire. Then she added small triangle ears. They stood at the window together for another 10 minutes, building the fox in condensation on the glass, adding features, losing them as the fog faded and they had to breathe new fog and start again, while the morning moved around them. Neither of them said anything. Neither of them needed to. When Ethan came down at 7:40 and stood in the doorway of the breakfast room, he saw his daughter and his housekeeper standing side by side at the window, adding to something on the glass, their heads tilted at the same slight angle. He stood there for a moment without either of them noticing him. He went to get coffee. He came back and sat at the breakfast table and opened his phone and stared at it without reading anything. He had 5 conversations he needed to have, He had a company to dismantle and a cover-up to expose, and a woman whose life his employees had destroyed standing at his window, drawing foxes on glass with his daughter. He drank his coffee. He wasn't ready. But the morning was already happening, the way mornings do, whether you're ready or not. The coffee in Ethan's cup had gone cold before he finished reading the full report a fourth time. He'd counted without meaning to, 4 times through 106 pages of investigative notes, insurance filings, licensing board transcripts, and internal communications that Marcus had assembled with the kind of quiet thoroughness that made Ethan pay him what he paid him. 4 times. And the document had not improved. The facts did not soften on repetition. They did not become more ambiguous or more forgivable. They just sat there on the screen in 11-point Times New Roman, patient and immovable, waiting for him to decide what kind of man he was going to be about them. He had 3 meetings scheduled for the morning. His assistant in the city had sent 3 reminder emails, each one slightly more pointed than the last. The board was expecting him on a call at 10. His CFO wanted 30 minutes before that to walk through the restructuring proposal. He closed his laptop. He sat in the kitchen, not his office, the kitchen, where the light was different and the room didn't smell like scotch and stale ambition, and he thought about a highway at night, a wet road, a car burning on the shoulder while a woman he'd never met crawled through a deformed window frame because there was a child inside and the child was alive and the woman was a nurse, and apparently that combination produced decisions that most people would not make. He thought about what had been done to her afterward. He had not. In 2 years of grief and corporate maneuvering, and the blunt survival of running a billion-dollar operation while personally falling apart, asked a single question about the accident's aftermath for anyone besides Sophie. He had assumed, and this assumption now sat in his chest like something swallowed wrong, that the legal team had handled it. That was what legal teams were for. He wrote the checks, they handled it, and the space between those two things had been, for 2 years, conveniently opaque. He understood now what had lived in that opacity. He called Marcus at 8:15. "The 2 witnesses," he said, without greeting, "the ones who testified against her to the licensing board. Find out who they were." "I already looked at that," Marcus said. "You're not going to like it." "Tell me anyway." "One of them was a junior attorney from the company's legal firm. The other was a claims adjuster from the vehicle insurance carrier." A pause. "Neither of them was at the scene." Ethan pressed the bridge of his nose. "So they testified about what exactly?" "Procedural standards. What a nurse is and isn't permitted to do at an accident scene without active employment. They framed it as unauthorized medical intervention that potentially complicated the emergency response." Another pause, smaller. "The board took it seriously because of the professional credentials on both sides. The attorney knew the right language." "The attorney knew the right language," Ethan repeated. "Yeah." He let that sit. "Find me everything you can on who authorized that move," he said. "Which partner at the firm, which executive in our legal department. I want a name. That might take a few days to—" "Then start now." He set the phone down and went to find Claire. She was in the east corridor on the 2nd floor, where she had been the previous morning, running a cloth over the long row of silver frames that held photographs nobody looked at. She heard him coming this time. He wasn't trying to be quiet. And she stopped what she was doing, but didn't turn around. "Claire," he said. "I heard you the first time," she said, to the wall. Her voice was level in the way that things are level when someone has spent the night deciding to be level. "I've been thinking about what you said in the kitchen." "So have I." She turned around. Her expression was different from the careful neutral of the day before. There was something sharper in it now, more deliberate. She was wearing her uniform jacket with the collar slightly uneven, and she'd pulled her hair back in a way that looked functional rather than arranged. She looked like someone who had gotten very little sleep and made a decision anyway. "What do you want from me?" she said. "I need to understand that before any other part of this conversation." "I don't want anything from you," Ethan said. "That's not an answer. People who say they don't want anything always want something." He acknowledged this with a slight inclination of his head. She wasn't wrong. He'd spent 14 years in business negotiating with people who said they didn't want anything. "I want to understand what happened, the full sequence, and I want—" He stopped, recalibrated. "I owe you an explanation of what I found out, and probably an apology, though I suspect an apology isn't really what this situation calls for. Claire looked at him for a long moment. Her jaw worked slightly, like she was selecting from a number of responses and discarding most of them. "Not today," she said finally. He didn't push. "Okay." "I'll finish the corridor," she said, and turned back to the frames. He stood there for a moment, then walked away, and the sound of the cloth moving over silver started up again behind him. It was the most honest conversation he'd had with another adult in months. He went to his office and missed all 3 meetings. The assistant in the city sent a 4th email, the tone of which had moved from pointed to genuinely alarmed. The board's administrative coordinator called twice and left messages. His CFO, a 55-year-old named Richard Seo, who had been with the company for 11 years and had the patience of a man who'd weathered a lot of Ethan's moods, texted at 11:30. "Do you need me to reschedule everything?" Ethan texted back, "Yes." Richard's response took 30 seconds. "Figured. I'll push to next week. You okay?" Ethan stared at the question. It was the kind of thing people asked without quite meaning it. It was social lubrication, a signal that the ask was there if needed without actually requiring an answer. He'd said, "I'm fine" to that question approximately 400 times in the last 2 years. He put his phone face down on the desk. In the afternoon, he did something he hadn't done in several months. He went downstairs during Sophie's free time and sat on the floor of the playroom. Sophie was at her low table with a box of colored pencils, drawing something that looked from across the room like an animal of indeterminate species. She didn't acknowledge his arrival directly, but she also didn't go still in the particular way she went still when she wanted to disappear. She kept drawing. He sat against the wall with his knees up and said nothing for a while. Through the playroom's window, he could see the groundskeeper working on the east side of the garden, and he watched the groundskeeper move without any particular interest while the sound of pencils moved across paper beside him. "She was nice," Sophie said. He turned so fast he nearly knocked his elbow on the wall. Sophie was still looking at her drawing. Her pencil was still moving. Blue. She was filling in something blue. She'd said it the way children sometimes say things, conversationally, as if picking up a thread from a discussion that only they had been having inside their head. "Who was?" Ethan said. His voice came out carefully, the way you carry something hot. "The shadow lady." He sat very still. The pencil kept moving. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "She was." Sophie lifted her pencil and looked at what she'd drawn. Then she picked up a different color, orange, and started on something else. The conversation apparently was finished. She'd said what she wanted to say. Ethan stayed on the floor for another 40 minutes. When he finally got up, his back aching from the angle, he went to find Claire. She was in the utility room off the kitchen, sorting through cleaning supplies with the focused efficiency of someone creating order in a small space because they can't create order anywhere else. She heard him come in and she waited, which he'd started to realize was a habit of hers. She waited for the thing to arrive instead of bracing preemptively. "Sophie spoke," he said. Claire's hands stopped moving. "She said you were nice." He leaned against the doorframe. "She called you the shadow lady." He watched something move through Claire's expression, not quite breaking, but something near the surface that hadn't been there before. She looked down at the shelf she was organizing and then back up. "She spoke," Claire said. "Full words?" "Full sentence. 2 of them." Claire pressed her lips together. She turned back to the shelf. He could see from the angle of her shoulders that she was working to keep her breathing even, and he recognized this because it was what he did when something hit harder than he was prepared to let it hit in front of witnesses. "Good," she said quietly. "That's really good." "I know." He waited. "I'm not telling you because I want something from it. I just thought you should know." She nodded, still facing the shelf. He left her there. That evening, he sat in the library, a room he'd almost never used in 2 years, a room that had been primarily Rebecca's, full of Rebecca's books and Rebecca's organizational system that he didn't know and had never asked about. And he pulled out one of the full files Marcus had sent and read through the licensing board transcript for the first time. The transcript was 63 pages. It was the record of 3 days of hearings in December 2023, 2 months after the accident. He read it over the course of 3 hours, and he read it the way he'd learned to read complex documents. Not for the narrative, but for what was missing. For the gaps. for the places where the testimony didn't quite connect. Claire had represented herself. He'd known this from the summary, but reading the actual transcript made it concrete in a different way. Her statements were clear, detailed, technically specific. The account of a clinician who understood exactly what she'd done and why, and who was trying to explain this to a panel that had already received a different interpretation from people who understood the institutional language better than she did. She'd said, in her testimony, "I identified a conscious child in a burning vehicle. I had a 7-minute window before the fire reached the fuel line. I made the call that I would make again." The opposing attorney had responded, "But you were not dispatched to that scene in any professional capacity. Is that correct?" And Claire had said, "I was a nurse on a highway. The capacity is the capacity." The panel had not found this persuasive. Ethan read the line twice. The capacity is the capacity. He put the transcript down. He looked at Rebecca's bookshelves. Her organizational system appeared to be alphabetical by author within subject categories. But the subject categories were her own, which meant the groupings reflected the way she'd thought about things rather than any standard taxonomy. There was a section that seemed to be about illness and healing, and a section about history, and a longer section he couldn't immediately categorize that contained everything from mythology to physics to 3 different books about birds. He hadn't touched any of it in 2 years. He stood up and ran his finger along the spines of the illness and healing section. He wasn't looking for anything specific. He just needed his hands to be doing something while his brain processed what it was processing. He stopped at a thin paperback, a book about childhood trauma and recovery, the kind of accessible clinical text that gets written by practitioners for a general audience. He pulled it out. It had a bookmark in it, a receipt from a grocery store, dated 14 months before the accident, which was the kind of detail that arrived like a small punch. Rebecca had been reading about childhood trauma recovery 14 months before Sophie experienced any trauma. He stood there for a moment, holding the book. Of course she had. Rebecca had always been reading the thing before you needed the thing. She'd always been 3 steps ahead of the problem you hadn't identified yet. He put the book back. He couldn't read it tonight. He went upstairs to his office and called Marcus again. "The name," he said. "The executive who authorized the legal maneuver against Claire Dawson. You have anything?" "I have something," Marcus said. "But you need to understand that this is going to implicate people at the senior level." "Tell me." "The decision came from 2 people, Harrison Webb, your chief legal officer, and David Park, your head of risk management." A pause. "It was documented as standard liability containment procedure. It's in an email chain from October 2023, about 3 weeks after the accident. Webb initiates it, Park signs off, they bring in the outside firm. Harrison Webb had been with the company for 8 years. He'd been at Ethan's wedding. He'd sent flowers when Rebecca died. He'd sent flowers, and then 3 weeks later had authorized the destruction of the woman who'd saved Sophie's life." "Thank you," Ethan said, and his voice was very flat. "Don't say anything to anyone. I'll be in the city in 2 days." He sat in his office for a while after he hung up, not doing anything in particular, letting the information settle into its permanent shape. This was how he'd always processed big things. He needed them to stop feeling new before he could act on them. Premature action, Rebecca had told him once, was just anxiety in a disguise. He thought about Claire in the utility room, working to keep her breathing even. He thought about Sophie on the playroom floor. She was nice. He opened his laptop and started writing. Not an email, not yet. A list. The thing he was going to do and the order in which he was going to do it and the people it was going to cost him. He'd made lists like this before, at the early stages of business decisions that had seemed impossible until they were on paper. Paper, or the screen equivalent, turned abstract things into sequential things, and sequential things were manageable. He wrote for an hour. By the end of it, he had a document that was 3 pages long and that was going to cost him, by his rough estimate, about a third of the company's current valuation in litigation, settlements, and executive departures. He read it back once. He didn't change anything. Then he went to bed and slept, for the first time in months, without the scotch. In the morning, he came down early. The kitchen was empty. The cook didn't start until 7, and the rest of the staff moved on their own schedules. And he made coffee badly, the way he always made coffee badly when he did it himself,
too strong and slightly burned because he could never remember that the setting he'd chosen was too high. He was sitting at the kitchen table with the bad coffee and his phone when Claire came in at 6:50. She stopped when she saw him. She'd learned, apparently, not to be surprised by him in the kitchen anymore, but something about his posture, he wasn't sure what exactly, maybe just the absence of his usual controlled tension, made her pause differently this time. "You look like you slept," she said. "First time in a while." She moved to the counter and started water for tea. She was methodical about it, not anxious, not performative, just someone making tea. "I want to tell you what I found," Ethan said. "When you're ready, not for any reason except that you should know all of it, what they did, the whole sequence."
Claire didn't answer immediately. She waited for the water to go on, and then she turned around and leaned against the counter with her arms folded across her chest. The kitchen light was different at 6:50, softer, the whole house not yet fully committed to the day, and she looked in it like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had started wondering whether she'd stop noticing the weight. "Why?" she said. "What does it do for you?" "Nothing," Ethan said. "It doesn't do anything for me." "Then why?" "Because you deserve to know what actually happened to you." He paused. "And because I'm going to do something about it, and you should probably understand what that looks like before it starts." Claire's arms tightened slightly across her chest. "What does that mean? You're going to do something about it." "I'm going to the city in 2 days. I'm going to deal with the people responsible." She stared at him. "Deal with them how?" "Fire them. Report them to the Bar Association. Give everything I have to federal investigators and let them work out what charges apply." He said this the same way he talked about quarterly restructuring, not because he was performing calm, but because he'd made the decision the previous night, and decisions, once made, lost their dramatic charge. The cover-up involved insurance fraud, witness tampering, potentially perjury. That's not a civil matter anymore. Claire had gone very still. "Your legal team perjured witnesses in front of the licensing board," he said. "Witnesses who weren't at the scene and presented testimony they couldn't have firsthand knowledge of. Someone with the board may have been influenced. I don't know that yet, but there's a pattern that suggests it. All of that goes to federal investigators." "And what happens to your company?" "It'll survive or it won't." He picked up his coffee and found it had gone lukewarm. "I built it from nothing once." She was silent for a long moment. He could see her working through it. The practical implications, the timeline, what all of this would mean for her specifically and not in the abstract. "My license," she said finally. "I have a lawyer working on an emergency petition to the board for reinstatement. The grounds are that the testimony that supported the revocation was false, and we have documentation." He looked at her. "That should move fairly quickly once the witnesses are discredited. Weeks, maybe. Possibly faster." She turned to look at the window over the sink. Outside, the morning was gray and cold, and the lawn was still wet from 2 days ago. She stood with her back to him for a moment, and he could see the careful, controlled quality of her breathing, the ribcage moving with deliberate steadiness. "Weeks," she said to the window. "It's not fast enough," he said. "I know that." "No." She shook her head. "No, I wasn't." She stopped. Her voice had something in it he hadn't heard before, something that was trying to organize itself and not quite managing. 2 years, she said. I worked for a family in Westchester before this. The husband was a financial manager. The wife collected things. I cleaned their house for 7 months, and the wife never learned my last name. I don't think she tried. Her voice was level, but the levelness cost something now. And before that, I was in the city, sharing a place with 2 other women I found through an app, doing 3 different cleaning jobs to make rent. And before that was the hearings, and before that was Daniel. She stopped. "I'm sorry," Ethan said. He meant it in the way you mean things when sorry doesn't come close to the actual mass of the feeling it's standing in for. "You didn't do it," she said, automatically, the reflexive absolution people give. "My company did." "Your company?" She said it carefully, like she was deciding how much of that sentence to hand back to him. "My name is on the building," Ethan said. "My name is on the legal letterhead. The attorney who went to the licensing board was paid by my company and authorized by my executives." He set down his cup.
I don't get to stand outside that and say it wasn't me. She turned around. Something in her face had shifted. Not softened exactly, but changed register. Like she'd been expecting defensiveness and had received something else and wasn't sure yet what to do with that.
The kettle clicked off. She poured her tea.
Daniel was my fiancé, she said, to the tea rather than to him. He was 34. He taught high school history in the Bronx, and he was terrible at cooking, and he had this habit of narrating whatever he was doing while he did it, like a nature documentary about his own life. A short, painful exhale that wasn't quite a laugh. He drove me insane with it. I'd give... She stopped again, tightened her hands around the mug. He was in the car because he'd picked me up from my shift. I was working a double, and he knew I hated the drive home at that hour, so he just showed up. He didn't tell me he was coming. He just showed up. The kitchen was very quiet. He died about 40 feet from where I was, she said. I didn't find out until after. The paramedics told me at the hospital. She looked up from the tea. I didn't find out about Sophie until later either, that she'd survived. They didn't tell me at the hospital. There were a lot of people and a lot of chaos, and I wasn't technically involved in her care at that point. A nurse who'd treated her at the ER sent me a note about 3 weeks later, after I'd already given my statement to police. She said the little girl was physically okay. That was all I knew. Ethan said nothing. He had found over the last 2 years that there were moments that didn't benefit from words. That language introduced a kind of noise into spaces that needed to stay open for a moment longer. And then 2 months later, the board letter came, Claire said, and I thought I'd misread it. I read it 4 times. I kept thinking, there's been a mistake because the thing this letter is accusing me of is the thing I did to save that child's life. She set down the mug. It took me another month to figure out what had actually happened, who had filed the complaint. And by that point, the hearing was already scheduled and I didn't have money for an attorney, and the legal aid office told me the case was too specialized for them to take on. She looked at him steadily. And nobody from your company ever contacted me. Not once. No, Ethan said. They wouldn't have. Because I was the problem they were solving. Yes. She absorbed this with a small nod, the kind that isn't agreement but acknowledgement. The kind that says I already knew this, and it's worse hearing you confirm it, but at least the knowing is clean now. What do you need from me? She said. For the board petition, for the investigation, what documentation, what testimony? You don't have to do anything yet. The evidence is largely documentary. The communication records, the witness credentials, the timeline discrepancies, but eventually the investigators will want a statement from you. I'll give one. No hesitation. I'll give them everything I have. She reached out and picked up her tea again. I save copies of everything. The board letter, the hearing transcripts, the insurance company correspondence. I've had them in a folder for 2 years. Something in Ethan's chest shifted. You've been carrying that for 2 years. I didn't know what else to do with it. She said it without drama. The simple, practical fact of it. I couldn't act on it. I didn't have the resources to act on it, but I kept thinking. Maybe someday. You keep the documents because you keep the possibility. He looked at her across the kitchen table. She was standing with her tea and her uneven collar and her practical pulled-back hair, and she was 30 years old and had been compressed over 2 years into the exact shape of someone who had decided that possibility was the thing you protected, even when everything else was gone. Your license will be restored, he said. I'm committing to that. Whatever it takes. Don't, she said. Don't what? Don't promise me things. Not sharply, just firmly, the kind of firm that comes from experience. People have promised me things, and then the world happened. I'd rather deal with what's actual. Okay, he said. Then here's what's actual. I have documentation that materially undermines the testimony that resulted in your revocation. I have an attorney who believes the petition will succeed, and I'm going to the city in 2 days to remove the people who authorized what happened to you. That's what's actual right now. She looked at him for a moment. Okay, she said. They sat with that for a minute. Not comfortably exactly, but in the way 2 people sit with something that is large and true and doesn't require any more words than it's already taken. Then Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, hair completely unmanaged, carrying a stuffed fox that Ethan had bought her 8 months ago and that she'd shown no particular attachment to until recently. She looked at Claire. She looked at Ethan.
She looked back at Claire. "Breakfast," she announced. It was the most authoritative single word she'd produced in 2 years. She said it like a person who had somewhere to be and expected others to organize accordingly around this fact. Claire's expression did the thing it had done in the utility room, something near the surface, carefully held. She looked at Ethan. He looked at her. "Yeah," Ethan said to his daughter. "Okay." He got up to figure out what he could make that wasn't bad coffee, and Sophie climbed into one of the kitchen chairs and arranged the fox on the table in front of her with the serious consideration of someone establishing territory, and Claire moved to the other side of the kitchen to look through the cabinet where the cook kept the breakfast things. None of them talked much. The morning moved around them in the particular way of mornings where something has shifted and the shift hasn't fully declared itself yet. Ethan burned the eggs slightly. Claire found cereal, which Sophie accepted with the dignified resignation of a child who has learned that adults can't always be trusted with hot food. The fox sat on the table facing outward. At some point, Sophie looked up from her bowl and made the shadow fox shape with her hands against the table, but the quick practice gesture Claire had made on the conservatory ceiling 3 nights ago. She looked at Claire when she did it. Claire made the shape back, her fingers against the kitchen counter, the shadow falling on the white cabinet. Sophie ate her cereal. The 3 of them stayed in the kitchen until the cook arrived at 7 and found this arrangement: the billionaire with burned eggs, the housekeeper with tea, the child with a fox, and had the good sense to simply ask who wanted toast. Later that morning, after Sophie had gone upstairs with Mrs. Pendleton, and the cook was doing the proper breakfast things, and the house had returned to its functional rhythms, Claire was in the east corridor again. Same frame, same cloth, the routine that held the day together. Ethan passed through on his way to the office and stopped. "Claire," she paused, didn't turn around. "For what it's worth," he said, "what you did, on the highway, getting into that car." He stopped because the sentence didn't have an end that was adequate to what it was trying to carry. "Sophie's here because of you, that's—" "I haven't said that to you directly." She was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. Not arrogantly, just, "Yes, I know this. It is the one thing in 2 years that has made any of it feel like it meant something." He nodded, though she couldn't see it. He went to his office and made the calls that needed to be made and set in motion the things that needed to be set in motion. And that afternoon he booked a car for Thursday morning to the city, because something was going to happen in a Manhattan boardroom that could not be undone afterward. And that was, he had decided, entirely fine. Down the corridor, the cloth moved in steady circles over silver frames. In the playroom, a small girl with a stuffed fox drew shadow shapes in the margins of her coloring book because she was practicing, and she was patient, and she had decided without quite knowing she'd decided it, that there were things worth making noise about again. The car to the city was scheduled for Thursday at 7 in the morning. Wednesday arrived cold and unsettled, the kind of late October day that can't decide between rain and not rain, and resolves the question by doing both intermittently, the sky moving through shades of gray in a way that felt less like weather and more like a mood. Ethan had been up since 5. He'd packed nothing, because he wasn't staying overnight. This was a same-day trip, in and out, the kind of visit you make when you need to look at people directly while you take something from them. He had 3 meetings arranged through Marcus. The first was with the federal investigator Marcus had identified as the appropriate contact for what they had. The second was with the attorney handling Claire's licensing petition to go over the supplemental evidence package before it was filed. The third was with Harrison Webb and David Park, which was not technically a meeting so much as a termination, and which Ethan had been turning over in his mind for 2 days with the particular focus he brought to things he was certain about. He was in his office at 5:15 reviewing documents when he heard the front door. Not the main entrance, the side door off the mudroom that the staff used. He heard it open and then, a moment later, close, and then footsteps on the gravel path that ran along the east side of the building. He went to the window. Claire was outside. She was in her coat, a dark green wool thing that had clearly been good quality once, and was now in the late stages of a long life, moving along the gravel path toward the garden at the back of the property. She wasn't walking quickly or slowly. She was just walking, in the particular way of someone who needed to be outside before the day fully arrived and before anyone required anything of them. Ethan watched her for a moment. Then he went back to his documents. At 6, he went down to make coffee, badly again, and found that Claire had come back in and was already in the kitchen. She'd made a full pot, properly, the settings right, and she was sitting at the table with both hands around a mug and a look on her face that was somewhere between composed and somewhere else entirely. She looked up when he came in. "You're going today," she said. "This morning." She nodded. She looked back at her mug. "I've been thinking about what you said, about Webb and Park." She said the names carefully, like she'd been holding them in her mouth, testing their weight. "Are you going to tell me I should be there when you do it?" "No," Ethan said. "You don't need to be anywhere near those people." "I thought maybe you'd want a witness." "Marcus will be there." He poured his coffee and sat across from her. "This isn't about witnesses. It's about removal. They're not going to dispute the documentation." Claire turned her mug in her hands, a slow rotation, thinking. "And the investigators? Will they talk to me soon?" "Probably within the week. The attorney will prep you first." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the sky was doing its indecisive rain-not-rain thing, and the early light through the window was thin and gray. "I keep trying to work out how I feel about it," she said, "and I can't quite get there. 2 years of wanting this, wanting someone to have to answer for it, and now that it's actually happening, I just feel sort of—" She stopped. "Flat," Ethan said. She looked at him. "Yeah," he said. "That's how it goes, usually. The thing you've been carrying doesn't go away the second someone else picks it up. It just stops being yours to carry alone." She considered this. "Is that how it felt? When Rebecca died? People tell you time heals things, and—" She stopped. Her expression shifted. The slight recoil of someone who has said a name they hadn't planned to say. "Sorry," she said. "That was—" "No." He held up a hand. "It's fine." He looked at his coffee. "Time doesn't heal anything, in my experience. Time just keeps going, and you either move with it or you don't. The shape of the thing doesn't change. You just get more practiced at carrying it." Claire absorbed this without the reflexive sympathy people usually offered. He appreciated that. He was tired of sympathy that was really just discomfort dressed up. "She was trying to do the shadows when it happened," Claire said, very quietly. Ethan went still. "In the car, before the impact." Claire's voice was level, but the levelness was costing something significant now. "I was behind you on the highway, maybe 100 feet back. I saw her in the passenger seat. She'd turned around toward Sophie's car seat, and she had her phone out and she was making the shapes against the headliner." She paused. "The road was wet. Your driver was going faster than the conditions. I could see it from behind. The way the car was sitting in the lane wasn't right." Another pause. "I'd already started to slow down before it happened." Ethan had not known this. He had the accident report. He'd read it 6 times in the weeks after, in the compulsive way of grief, reading police documents at 2 a.m. as if the right parsing of the language would produce a different outcome. The report had said that his vehicle had struck the median barrier and crossed into the southbound lane. It had said that the first responder at the scene had been a passing motorist. It had not said that the passing motorist had watched it happen. "She got the fox right," Claire said, "before the collision. She had it and Sophie was laughing. I could see Sophie's face from the angle. She was laughing. And then the car moved wrong." She pressed her lips together. "I've gone over it a lot. 2 years of going over it. I don't know if that's useful information or not. It's—" He stopped. His throat had tightened in a way that made talking complicated. Rebecca always got the fox right. She practiced it. He looked at his hands on the table. She'd do it in the car when there was no storm, just to have it ready. Sophie went through this phase where she was terrified of thunder, and Rebecca just decided she was going to make thunder into the shadow game. She practiced for weeks. The kitchen was very quiet. "She sounds like someone who decided things," Claire said. "Yeah," he exhaled. She was very decided. They sat in the thin gray morning light for a while, not talking. The rain tapped at the window in an irregular pattern. Somewhere above them, the house was starting to wake up. Water in pipes, a door, Mrs. Pendleton's footsteps crossing the floor above the kitchen. "I should go," Ethan said. "The car's coming at 7. He stood. Claire looked up at him. "Thank you," she said, "for going." "Don't thank me for this one," he said. "This one I'm doing because it's the right thing, and also because I'm angry. Those aren't the same as doing something for someone." Something close to a real expression passed across her face. Not quite a smile, but something that shared a neighborhood with one. "Okay," she said, "then good luck being angry." "I don't need luck for this," he said, and went to get his jacket. The car came at 7:05, a black sedan driven by a man named Gary, who had been transporting Ethan for 4 years and had learned in those 4 years that Ethan Calloway in a certain mood meant silence and a direct route. Gary took one look at his passenger's face when Ethan climbed in and didn't say anything for the entire 2-hour drive except to mention, once, that there was construction on the bridge. Ethan read documents for the first hour and stared out the window for the second. The federal building was on the lower end of Manhattan, a gray institutional structure that looked exactly like a place where paperwork determined outcomes. Marcus met him outside, early 50s, a former investigator himself, which was why he was useful, with a lined face and the contained energy of a man who had seen most things and been surprised by very few of them. "The meeting's at 9, Marcus said as they walked in. "Agent Caruso handles white collar. She's good. She'll ask you about your authorization for the internal documents." "I own the company," Ethan said. "I authorized myself." "She'll still ask. Let me answer that one." The meeting with Agent Caruso lasted 2 hours and 20 minutes. She was 40, with close-cropped hair, and the habit of writing things down on paper in an era when everyone used tablets, which Ethan recognized as the mark of someone who trusted only what they'd physically recorded. She asked clear, specific questions and made no promises, which was the right approach. At one point, she looked across the table at Ethan and said, "You understand that you're implicating your own legal department. This isn't a rogue actor situation. This is documented institutional conduct." "I understand that." "And you're aware this investigation could result in civil exposure for the company itself, not just the individuals." "I'm aware." She looked at him for a moment, in the way investigators look at people when they're running an internal calculation. "Okay," she said, "we'll open the inquiry. I'll need a contact for the documentation transfer." "Marcus," Ethan said. "He'll handle the logistics." He was outside the federal building by 11:15. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the thin November sunlight and let the noise of lower Manhattan wash over him. It was the kind of city noise that was always there, that you stopped hearing after a while, the continuous white noise of 8 million people doing 8 million things. And he stood in it and felt, for a moment, simply present. Just a man on a sidewalk, not a billion-dollar corporation, not a grieving husband, not a father with a silent daughter. Just a man in a coat who had just done the first thing in 2 years that felt like the correct use of whatever power he had. He texted Marcus, licensing attorney, next. The attorney was a woman named Patricia Cole, whose office was in Midtown and who had been retained specifically for the board petition. She was 60 and had the sharp, efficient manner of someone who had been practicing law long enough to have stopped performing urgency and simply operated at whatever pace got things done. She'd reviewed the supplemental evidence, the witness credential issues, the timeline inconsistencies, the communications chain, and she met Ethan's arrival with a direct assessment. "The petition is strong," she said. "The problem is the board moves on its own schedule, and there's no formal mechanism to accelerate a reinstatement review." She sat back in her chair. "What we have is strong enough that they should move. Whether they will move quickly is a different question." "What makes them move quickly?" Ethan said. She looked at him over her reading glasses. "Media attention, sometimes. Political pressure, occasionally. A very clear indication that proceeding slowly will result in more legal scrutiny than proceeding quickly." She took her glasses off. "In this case, I'd say the federal investigation opening gives us the third option. Once there's an active federal inquiry touching the testimony that supported the revocation, the board has significant incentive to distance itself from that testimony quickly." "File the petition today," Ethan said. "Reference the federal inquiry." She nodded. "I plan to." She paused. "Mr. Calloway, I want to be honest with you about timelines. Even with all of this moving in the right direction, we're talking weeks, minimum, possibly 6 to 8 weeks for a full reinstatement." "She's waited 2 years," Ethan said. "She can wait 8 more weeks if she needs to." Patricia Cole looked at him for a moment. She wrote something on her notepad. "I'll file this afternoon." He was back in a car by 1:30, heading uptown toward Calloway corporate headquarters. The building was in Midtown, 42 stories, with the company name on the exterior in the understated typeface that Rebecca had chosen when they'd moved to the new space 6 years ago. She'd said the original font was trying too hard. He'd deferred to her, the way he deferred to her on all things, where she was unambiguously more right than him. Harrison Webb's office was on the 38th floor. David Parks was 2 doors down from it. Marcus had arranged for both of them to be available for a 3 o'clock meeting, described on their calendars as a portfolio strategy review. Ethan had wanted it that way. He didn't want either man to have time to consult his attorney or arrange his posture. He went in through the lobby at 2:45. The receptionist recognized him. Of course she did. This was his building. And said good afternoon with the particular register of someone who knows the boss doesn't usually appear without announcement and is trying to assess whether that's a problem. He told her not to call up. He took the elevator to 38. Webb's assistant, a young man named Chris who'd been there about 6 months, looked up when Ethan walked off the elevator and immediately developed the expression of someone recalculating very fast. "Mr. Calloway," Chris said. Harrison didn't mention, "He doesn't know I'm here," Ethan said pleasantly. "Is he in?" Yes, but he's on a, tell him I'll see him now." He kept walking. He opened Webb's office door without knocking. Harrison Webb was 61, a tall man with silver hair who wore his authority like a fitted suit. It sat on him well, and he was aware that it sat on him well. He was on the phone when Ethan walked in, and the expression that crossed his face was a quick sequence of surprise, calculation, recovery. He said something into the phone, "I'll have to call you back," and set it down. "Ethan." He stood, which was what you did when the person who owned the company walked into your office. "I didn't know you were coming in." "I know." Ethan sat in one of the chairs across from Webb's desk, not the chair positioned for subordinates, the one on the side equal height, which required Webb to turn slightly to face him. Small thing. It mattered. "What can I—" Webb started. "I need you to get David Park in here," Ethan said. "Call him yourself. Don't have Chris do it." Something moved through Webb's expression. He was good at the controlled face. 8 years of corporate legal work, and before that, a decade in private practice. Plenty of time to develop the face. But Ethan had spent those same 8 years sitting across tables from people running the controlled face, and he could see the thing underneath it. Webb picked up his desk phone and called Park directly. "David, come to my office." A pause. "Now." Park arrived in 90 seconds, which meant he'd been close, probably already on his way over to see what was happening. He was 53, compact, with the careful energy of a man who worked in risk management and therefore approached most situations as potential risks. He walked in, saw Ethan, and stopped just past the door. "Close it," Ethan said. Park closed the door. Ethan waited until Park had moved far enough into the room to make standing there uncomfortable. Then he opened the folder on his knees. He'd brought a physical folder, paper, the same choice Agent Caruso had made, and set it on the desk where both men could see it. "October 2023, he said. 3 weeks after the accident, you initiated a complaint to the state nursing board against a woman named Claire Dawson." He looked at Webb. "You drafted the communication. You brought in Aldworth and Foster to handle it." The outside firm. David signed off on the liability containment framing. He looked at Park. Neither man said anything. "The witnesses you arranged to testify before the board," Ethan continued, "were a junior attorney from Aldworth and Foster and a claims adjuster from the vehicle carrier. Neither was present at the accident. Both provided testimony framed as professional assessment of conduct they did not personally witness." He closed the folder. "That is witness tampering, potentially perjury, depending on how the investigators frame it." "Ethan." Webb's voice was careful, controlled. "This was a standard liability management procedure. The company had significant exposure after the accident, and we needed to—" "I know what you needed," Ethan said. "You needed to reduce exposure by discrediting the person who could testify about what the contractor was doing that night." He paused. "I've read the email chain. I know the sequence. I know that the complaint to the board was filed specifically because Claire Dawson had a professional license that could be revoked, and a revoked license would undermine her credibility as a potential witness." He looked at Webb steadily. I know you did this while she was still dealing with the death of her fiancé. The same accident, different car. Webb's jaw tightened slightly. I also know, Ethan said, that the reason the contractor was operating that vehicle at the speed he was operating it on a wet road at night is that your department had cleared the contractor's use of the vehicle under conditions that violated 3 internal safety protocols. He set the folder down on the desk. All of that is with federal investigators as of 9 o'clock this morning. The silence in the room was the kind that has texture to it. Park spoke first. His voice was impressively almost steady. You went to federal investigators with internal company documents. I authorized the document transfer, Ethan said. I own the company. The board, Webb started. Won't be hearing from you about this, Ethan said, because you won't be employed here after today. He stood up. I want your access cards by end of business. Your attorneys will be in touch with our HR department and the company's new legal counsel. I'm suspending the relationship with Aldworth and Foster effective today, about severance and related matters. He picked up the folder. I'd recommend retaining personal legal representation quickly. The investigators will want to speak to you both. Webb was looking at him with something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite fear, a kind of affronted disbelief, like a man who has operated inside a particular set of rules for a long time and has encountered suddenly a different set. Ethan, everything we did was to protect this company. It was to protect you. The exposure on that accident. So stop, Ethan said, not loudly. Don't tell me it was to protect me. I wasn't asked. Nobody asked me whether I wanted the woman who saved my daughter's life destroyed to manage the company's liability exposure. His voice was level, and it cost him to keep it that way. If you'd told me in October 2023 that a nurse had climbed into that burning car and kept Sophie alive for 11 minutes, do you know what I would have done? Webb said nothing. I would have found her, and I would have made sure she was taken care of, Ethan said. That's what I would have done, because that's what a person does. He moved toward the door. What you did instead is what people do when they think the company is the thing that matters. He left. He walked down the hall, past Chris's desk, to the elevator. He pressed the button and stood waiting, and his hands were not entirely steady, and he noticed this with a kind of distant interest, because his hands were almost always steady. That was one of the things he was known for, actually. The steadiness, the controlled face, the affect of a man to whom things did not stick. Things had been sticking for a while. He'd just been very careful about where. The elevator came. He rode it down 40 stories and walked out into the midtown afternoon. Marcus was outside on the sidewalk where he'd waited during both meetings. He looked at Ethan's face and said simply, "Done?" "Done." Ethan stood on the sidewalk, not moving toward the car. The midtown noise was different up here than downtown. Denser, more compressed, the particular energy of the center of a city. They're going to lawyer up tonight. Expected. Make sure the document transfer to Caruso is complete before tomorrow. I don't want any internal obstruction attempts to complicate the access. Already handled. I sent the secondary package while you were upstairs. Ethan nodded. He stood there another moment, looking at nothing in particular. The afternoon light was doing something interesting off the glass of the building across the street. He thought about Claire's folder, the one she'd kept for 2 years, the documents she'd preserved because she'd held on to the word maybe. She'd kept the documents because she'd kept the possibility. He'd done this, today, all of this, faster than he'd expected. Once the decision was made, the execution had been almost straightforward, which was the thing about decisions that had been delaying themselves for too long. They moved quickly once you let them. "Gary's a block up," Marcus said. "I know." He still didn't move. Marcus, the contractor, the one driving the car that night. He hadn't mentioned this in either meeting because it wasn't the urgent item, but it had been sitting in the back of his mind. Where is he now? Marcus was quiet for a moment. He was let go about 6 weeks after the accident, paid out a significant settlement, signed an NDA. The NDA is probably unenforceable now, Ethan said. If the investigators want him. Probably. Let it happen. He turned toward the car. Don't protect the settlement. Let Caruso go wherever she needs to go. That'll cost the company substantially more in civil exposure. I know. He started walking. Let it happen anyway. Gary drove him back through the afternoon traffic, which was considerable, and Ethan sat in the back seat and felt the particular hollowness that comes after an adrenaline-driven day winds down. He wasn't sorry. He wasn't second-guessing. He was just empty, in the way of a person who has expended a significant amount of themselves and has not yet been refilled. He dozed somewhere around the bridge, which he never did in cars. He'd stopped sleeping in moving vehicles after the accident. Another of those involuntary changes that he hadn't noticed until the habit was established. And he woke up when they turned off the highway, 40 minutes from the estate. He got back at 7:15. The house was lit warm from the outside, which he still sometimes noticed as a separate thing from entering it. The warm-lit windows against the dark property, the way it looked from outside, like a place where things were okay. He went in through the front. The entry hall was quiet. He could hear the sound of the television from somewhere. Mrs. Pendleton allowed Sophie 30 minutes of something before bed. He'd agreed to this months ago and then promptly forgotten to pay attention to the scheduling of it. He followed the sound to the small sitting room off the main hall. Sophie was on the sofa in her pajamas, the stuffed fox tucked under her arm, watching something animated on the screen. Claire was in the armchair to the side of the sofa. She had a book open on her knee, but she wasn't reading it. She was watching Sophie watch television in the unconscious, half-attentive way of an adult present with a child, but not directing them. Both of them turned when he came in. Sophie held up the fox. "Hey, Bug." He went over and sat on the sofa beside her, something he hadn't done in months. The casual, unplanned act of just sitting next to his daughter without it being structured time or therapeutic engagement. Sophie shifted to make room for him without being asked, the automatic accommodation of a child who knows her space, and then she leaned slightly into his arm, just the lightest press of her small shoulder against his. He looked across at Claire. She looked back at him. He gave a slight nod. The kind that means it's done. It went the way it should. She held his eyes for a moment, and something passed through hers that he couldn't fully parse. Relief, maybe, or the complicated thing that exists between relief and grief and hasn't been given its own name yet. "Good," she said. Just that. He looked at the television. On the screen, something animated was happening with bright colors and clear moral stakes, the way children's narratives worked. The world organized into shapes that made sense. He watched it without following the plot. Sophie, at some point, reached over without looking at him and took his hand. She did it the way she did the shadow fox, with the focused practicality of someone who has decided something and is executing it. She put his hand in her lap and held onto it with both of hers, still watching the television, her fox tucked against her side. He didn't move. Claire looked at the window. The night outside was full dark now, the property invisible past the glass, just the reflection of the three of them in the lit room. A man and a child on a sofa. A woman in an armchair, a stuffed fox. The television played. The house made its quiet house sounds. Outside, somewhere in the dark, the last of the storm season's rain was collecting in the gutters and running down toward the lawn, and the old oaks at the eastern perimeter were dropping their final leaves in the still air, and the world was proceeding with its complete indifference to the specific rearrangements taking place inside one lit house. But inside, something that had been moving in one direction was slowly and without announcement beginning to move in another. Sophie fell asleep against Ethan's arm at 8:05, her breathing deepening into the uncomplicated rhythm of a child who has decided the current location is safe enough for this. He sat with her there, his hand still in her small ones, looking across at Claire. "She said 4 words today," Claire said quietly. She kept her voice low enough not to disturb Sophie. "To me, this afternoon. She wanted to show me something in the garden, and she said, 'Come look at this.'" He registered this. The weight of it, 4 words, the accumulation of them against 26 months of silence. What was in the garden? A bird's nest, empty, from last spring probably, wedged in the fork of one of the east oaks. She paused. She found it by herself. She'd been out there with Mrs. Pendleton and apparently broke away to investigate. Claire looked at her hands. She's doing it when she wants to, on her own terms. That's how it'll keep coming back. The therapist always said, I know what the therapist said. She wasn't sharp about it, just honest. They weren't wrong about the theory. They were just Sometimes the thing that helps a child talk again isn't a professional framework. It's just someone not needing them to. He looked at his sleeping daughter. The fox had slipped out from under her arm and was now wedged between her and the sofa cushion. "I owe you a conversation," Claire said. "A real one. About what I knew and when and why I stayed." "I know." "Not tonight." "No," he agreed. "Not tonight." She stood up, closed the book. He noticed she'd marked her page with a grocery receipt, the same way Rebecca had, and he tucked this observation away before it could do anything. And she moved to leave the room. She stopped in the doorway. "Did it go the way you needed it to?" she said. He thought about Webb's controlled face cracking slightly at the edges, about the folder on the desk, about Agent Caruso writing on paper, about Patricia Cole saying, "I'll file this afternoon," about himself in the elevator, his hands not quite steady, going down 40 stories. "Yeah," he said. "It did." She nodded once, like she'd confirmed something she'd already suspected, and walked out of the doorway and down the hall, and her footsteps faded toward the back of the house. Sophie breathed in and out against his arm. He stayed where he was for another hour, not doing anything. No phone, no documents, no window to stand at. Just the sofa and the sleeping child and the room that looked from the outside like a place where things were okay. After a while, he started to think it might be. The story broke on a Monday. Ethan had known it would break, had in fact engineered the conditions under which it would break, handing the documentation package to two separate investigative journalists the Thursday before, both of whom he'd worked with at different points in the company's history, and both of whom he trusted to handle the material accurately. He told them the same thing. "Publish when you're ready. Don't wait for a comment from the company's communications team, and if anyone on my staff tries to kill the story, call me directly." Neither of them had called him. The first piece went live at 6 in the morning on a Monday in early November, under a headline that was careful and specific in the way that good investigative journalism tended to be careful and specific. It named the company, named the individuals, described the cover-up in the sequential documented language of people who had checked their facts 3 times. By 8, the second piece was up on a different outlet with supplementary material. The email chain, the licensing board complaint, the witness credentials that didn't hold up. By 9, Ethan's phone had received 47 calls he hadn't answered, and the company's stock had dropped 6%. He was in the kitchen when it started. He'd been up at 5, which was becoming his new baseline. Some internal clock had reset in the last 2 weeks, the 2 a.m. deadline dropping away without his quite noticing when it happened. He'd made coffee, properly this time, because Claire had left a note on the machine 2 days ago that read, in her compact handwriting, "The setting is 1 lower than you think," and he'd adjusted it and the coffee had been better, and he hadn't mentioned this to her. He just made it the right way going forward. Claire came downstairs at 6:30, saw him at the table with his phone face down and his coffee, and the particular quality of focused stillness he had when something large was in motion, and she sat across from him without asking. "It's out," he said. She picked up her phone from her jacket pocket. He watched her read. Her face moved through the article in controlled increments. The slight shift at her name appearing in print for the first time in a context that was not the disciplinary notice, the small tightening around her eyes at the details of the cover-up, laid out in black text on a screen, the particular stillness when she got to the section that described what Daniel had been doing in the car that night. She set the phone down. "They got it right," she said. "I checked it before it went up, both pieces." She nodded. She was quiet for a moment. "My name is in there." "Yes." "My full name?" "Yes." He looked at her. "I should have asked you first, whether you wanted to be named or whether you wanted... I should have asked before I handed the material to them. That was my decision, and it should have been yours." She thought about this with the same careful honesty she brought to most things. "I would have said yes," she said finally. "I think. I would have been scared, but I would have said yes." She looked at her phone on the table. 2 years of being the person the story happened to and nobody knowing. There's something about having your name attached to the actual version of what happened. She paused. "It's different." "How?" "It makes it real. Like it counts now." She picked up the phone again and kept reading. He watched her face through the second half of the article, the section about the federal investigation, about Webb and Park, about the licensing petition. When she finished, she set it down again and looked at him across the table.
They mentioned Daniel Wright, she said quietly. The way they describe him, the history teacher. They got that part right.
I made sure of it, Ethan said. Her jaw tightened slightly, the way it did when she was managing something. Thank you. They sat with the morning for a while. At 8:15, his personal attorney called, not the company's legal team, his own man, a 60-year-old named Frank DeLuca, who had handled Ethan's personal affairs for a decade and who opened the call with, "The board is going to convene an emergency session. You need to be prepared for a removal vote." "They can vote," Ethan said. "I have majority control through the Class A shares." "Ethan, 4 board members are already—" "They can vote," he said again. "I'm not negotiating with the board on this one, Frank. Tell them that." A pause. "The stock is down 7% as of 8 o'clock. "I know." "The communications team is asking for guidance. They've got reporters calling every line they have. Tell communications to confirm the investigation is real and the individuals named in the pieces are no longer employed by the company. That's all they say. Nothing else." "That's going to leave a vacuum that—" "Frank," Ethan said, "I need you to trust me on the sequencing here. I know what it looks like. Let it look like that for a day." Another pause, longer. Frank DeLuca had been Ethan's attorney through the company's founding, through 3 acquisitions, through the accident and the aftermath, through 14 years of decisions that had ranged from brilliant to questionable. He'd learned, in those 14 years, when to push and when to trust the process. "Okay," he said. "One day. Call me by this evening." Ethan put the phone down. Claire was watching him. "The board might try to remove you," she said. It wasn't a question. "They might try." "Can they?" "No. But they'll spend the next 3 days believing they can, and that's going to generate a lot of noise." He picked up his coffee. "Companies do this. When they're threatened, the instinct is to sacrifice the person who created the threat rather than address the threat. The board will move to protect the company from me rather than move to protect me from the consequences of what the company did." "And you're fine with that?" He looked at her with mild honesty. "No," he said. "I'm not fine with it. I built this company. Watching it move against me because I'm doing the right thing is—" He stopped. "It's exactly as unpleasant as it sounds. But you're doing it anyway. I'm doing it anyway." She looked at him for a moment. "Why? And don't say because it's right. You already know it's right. That's not why people do things." He turned his coffee mug in his hands. The same rotation she made, he'd noticed, though this was probably just convergent habit, the thing people do when they're thinking. "Because Sophie is starting to speak again," he said, "and I can't be the father she needs and also be the person who let this slide." He looked at the window. "Those 2 things can't coexist. I've been trying to run them in parallel for 2 years. Keep the company, keep the version of myself the company requires. And it doesn't work." He set the mug down. "It stops working when your kid makes a shadow fox with a housekeeper who crawled into a burning car for her, and you realize you've been on the wrong side of something for 2 years without knowing it." Claire was quiet. "Also," he said, "I'm furious about Daniel, about your license, about the whole constructed, deliberate mechanism of it." He said this flatly, not for effect. "Furious helps when you're doing something expensive." She almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a smile he'd seen from her, and it was small and unfinished, but it was something. "Okay," she said. "Furious is honest, at least." At 9:30, the 3rd call from a board member came in, this one from Roger Hartley, the board chair, who was 70 and who operated in the patrician manner of men who had been consequential for long enough that they'd confused consequence with correctness. Ethan took this one. "Ethan." Roger's voice was the particular controlled concern of a man who was angry but had decided not to be visibly angry because visible anger was a concession. "We need to discuss this morning." "Discuss away." "The board is convening Thursday. There are questions about the decision-making that led to this morning's publications, specifically the decision to go to federal investigators and the press without board consultation." "I didn't require board consultation," Ethan said. "These were my personal decisions about personally authorized documentation. The board governs corporate strategy. This was a legal and ethical matter." "Ethan, This is a corporate crisis. This is a corporate reckoning, Ethan said. There's a difference. A crisis is when something bad happens to you. A reckoning is when something bad you did catches up with you. I'm trying to be precise about which one we're dealing with. A silence. Thursday, Roger said. Be there. I'll be there, Ethan said, and ended the call. The day moved in the way of days when a large thing is in motion and you are simultaneously driving it and watching it. Calls from the legal team, from communications, from 3 different board members, from Richard Seo, who simply said, "Are you eating?" in the tone of a man who had watched Ethan not eat through several previous crises and had given up on larger questions in favor of addressable ones. The stock moved up and down in increments that would have occupied all of Ethan's attention 6 months ago and now occupied roughly the same amount of attention he paid to weather. At 2 p.m, Patricia Cole called. The board has requested an expedited review, she said. The federal inquiry, combined with the media coverage, is apparently creating pressure they want to get ahead of. A pause. This is faster than I expected. I filed the petition Friday. They normally acknowledge within 2 weeks. They're acknowledging today. What does that mean practically? It means they want to resolve this before it becomes more of a story, which works in Claire's favor. He could hear her writing something. I need to speak with her, today, if possible. I need her formal statement and a review of the documents she's been keeping. I'll have her call you. He paused. Patricia, how fast, realistically? If the review moves quickly, 3 weeks, maybe less. I want to be honest with you that there's no guarantee on the timeline, but the conditions are as favorable as they're going to get. He found Claire in the East Garden, which surprised him. She was in the garden with Sophie, both of them crouched over something in the flower bed along the stone wall. He stopped at the edge of the garden and watched for a moment. Sophie was pointing at something in the soil, an earthworm, it turned out, when he got close enough to see. And explaining it to Claire in the deliberate, detailed way that children explain things they've recently learned from other adults, which meant Mrs. Pendleton had recently explained earthworms to Sophie, and Sophie was now passing this knowledge along. Her voice was quiet, still, the volume of someone who has recently rediscovered speaking and is calibrating how much air to put behind it, but the sentences were complete. Claire was listening with the full, unperformative attention she brought to most things Sophie said. She asked a question. Does it live there all winter? And Sophie considered this seriously before shaking her head and saying she didn't think worms liked winter, which was not biologically precise but was delivered with complete conviction. Ethan crouched down beside them. Sophie looked up at him, looked at the worm, looked back up. Worm, she informed him. I see that, he said. Good worm. She seemed to consider whether this assessment was adequate, then returned to the worm without further comment. He looked at Claire over Sophie's head. Cole called. She needs your statement today. And your documents. Claire straightened up. Something in her posture shifted. Not tensing exactly, but the subtle realignment of a person who has been briefly outside her situation and has now been returned to it. I have the folder in my room. She can do it by phone. She just needs the document scanned and sent. I can do that. She looked at Sophie, who had found a stick and was now conducting some kind of earthworm welfare assessment with it. Give me an hour with the scanner in the office. Take whatever you need. She nodded and went inside. Sophie looked up, tracked Claire's departure, looked at her father. Is she okay? Sophie said. Ethan sat fully down on the cold stone edge of the flower bed. Yeah, Bug, he said. She's working on being okay. It takes a while sometimes. Sophie thought about this with the serious, lateral consideration children apply to adult problems. Like when I couldn't talk, she said. He looked at his daughter. Yeah, he said. Exactly like that. Sophie went back to the worm. He sat in the cold garden for a while. Thursday arrived the way difficult things tend to arrive. On schedule, indifferent to whether you felt ready. Ethan drove himself to the city this time, which he almost never did because he needed the drive. He needed the 2 hours of highway and traffic lights and the particular meditative quality of movement without destination. Because what he was driving toward was a boardroom full of people who had known him for years and were now preparing to argue with him about his right to do the thing he'd already done. He arrived at the building at 8:15 and went up to 42, which was the board floor, above his own office, which was on 40, a spatial arrangement that had always struck him as mildly ironic. The board met in a room that faced south, with the skyline visible through windows that would have been beautiful if anyone in the room were looking at them. Nobody was ever looking at the windows during board meetings. There were 9 board members. 6 were in person, 3 were on screen. Roger Hartley was at the head of the table, in the chair that was slightly larger than the others, which Ethan had always found slightly ridiculous and had never said so. Ethan. Roger gestured to the seat that was clearly intended for him. Not at the head, not at Roger's right, but at the side, a position that put him across from the densest concentration of board members, the geography of a man who was being questioned. Ethan sat. He looked around the table. 9 faces, varying degrees of discomfort. James Whitfield, who had been on the board for 4 years and who Ethan genuinely respected, was looking at the table. Patricia Noah, who had joined 2 years ago and whose legal background made her useful in moments like this, was looking at Ethan with an expression he couldn't fully read. The others, directors who had been with the company in various capacities, who had various amounts of personal loyalty and various amounts of institutional self-interest, were arranging their faces in the performed neutrality of people about to conduct an interrogation. They want to appear balanced. "Thank you for coming," Roger said. "Of course," Ethan said. "It's my company." A small silence at that. "The board's concern," Roger began, and he was using his formal voice now, the one he used for recorded minutes, "is the process by which several significant actions were taken without board consultation or approval. The decision to share internal company documents with federal investigators. The decision to engage the press. The termination of 2 senior executives." He folded his hands. "These actions have resulted in significant reputational and financial exposure for the company, and the board has fiduciary responsibilities." "Roger," Ethan said, not rudely, just stopping him. "Can I ask who on this board knew what Webb and Park did?" The room went very still. "That's not what this meeting—" "I'd like to know," Ethan said, "before we discuss fiduciary responsibility, whether anyone in this room was aware that 2 members of my executive team orchestrated a false disciplinary action against a witness to an accident that killed my wife." He looked around the table, slowly, taking his time. Because if anyone in this room knew, then the fiduciary responsibility conversation is a different conversation than if no one knew. Nobody spoke. "I'm going to take that as no," Ethan said, "which means that the board's concern is about the method and not the substance. You're not here because you think I was wrong to expose the cover-up. You're here because I did it without asking first." Roger leaned forward. "Ethan, the method matters enormously in terms of legal exposure and shareholder. The method I used was the only method that would work," Ethan said. "If I'd brought it to the board first, the board would have referred it to legal counsel. Legal counsel would have recommended an internal investigation. An internal investigation would have produced a report in 4 months that recommended settlements and confidentiality agreements, and the woman whose career my company destroyed would still have no license and no remedy." He looked at Roger. "I've been in enough internal investigations to know how they end." Patricia Noah spoke. Her voice was careful and precise. "What you're describing as the only method is one interpretation. The board's position is that there were multiple paths forward, and you chose the one most damaging to the company's short-term position." "The board's position is correct," Ethan said. "It is more damaging in the short term. I knew that when I chose it." "Then you need to help us understand," Noah said, "what the long-term calculation was. Because right now what we have is a 13% stock decline, a federal investigation with open-ended scope, and 2 senior executives who are going to litigate their terminations. The long-term calculation," Ethan said, "is that this company has a name on the outside of the building. My name. And that name now means something different than it meant 3 weeks ago. Because 3 weeks ago, it was attached to a company that had buried evidence of its own misconduct and destroyed an innocent person to protect its liability position." He leaned forward slightly. "The stock recovered from a 7% drop in 2019 when we had the data breach. It recovered from 11% in 2021 after the regulatory fine. It will recover from this, and when it does, the company will have a different reputation than it had before. That is the long-term calculation." Whitfield looked up from the table. He'd been quiet through all of this. "And the nurse?" he said. "What happens to her?" "Her licensing petition is before the board now," Ethan said. The attorney expects reinstatement within 3 weeks based on the discredited testimony. I've set aside a personal fund, not company money, for a settlement that's being negotiated separately. She'll be compensated. Compensated, Whitfield said, in a tone that wasn't quite questioning the word and wasn't quite accepting it. There's no number that's actually adequate, Ethan said. I know that. She knows that. We're dealing in what's possible. He paused. She was a pediatric ER nurse. She was going to spend her career keeping children alive. My company took that from her for 2 years. Whatever we settle on isn't compensation. It's acknowledgement. The board meeting lasted another hour and 20 minutes. There were points about governance and process and fiduciary structure, points about communication protocols and the scope of executive authority, points about the legal exposure and who would manage the federal investigation relationship going forward. Ethan engaged with all of it, because these were real questions with real answers, and the board was not wrong to ask them. They were doing the job they were supposed to do. But nobody called a removal vote. Roger, at the end, looked at him across the table with the expression of a man who has been in a room with a decision that has already been made and knows it. The board is going to formalize some process requirements for executive communications with external authorities, he said, going forward. That's reasonable, Ethan said. We're also going to want a formal update on the federal investigation scope at the next quarterly meeting. Of course. Roger looked at him for a moment longer. He was 70 years old and he had been in rooms where things were decided for 50 years. And sometimes, in those 50 years, he had been in rooms where the decision was correct. He appeared to be making some internal accommodation with this being one of those rooms. I want it on record, Roger said, that the board does not endorse the method. The outcome, he paused, the outcome is what it is. Noted, Ethan said. He left the building at 1:30. He stood on the sidewalk in the November cold and called Marcus. How is it? Marcus asked. Contained, Ethan said. No removal vote. They're going to formalize some process requirements. Stock's up 2 points from this morning, Marcus said. The second news cycle is going better. The framing has shifted from company in crisis to executive accountability. Someone in financial media used the phrase ethical restructuring. Ethical restructuring, Ethan repeated. I know. Tell Richard to put out a brief statement this afternoon. Just the facts. The investigation, the executive changes, the commitment to cooperate fully. Nothing corporate speak, plain language. He'll want to run it through communications. Tell him plain language, Ethan said. If it sounds like a press release, rewrite it until it doesn't. He got in the car. He didn't doze on the drive back. He watched the city give way to the highway, give way to the valley, the landscape moving through its November version of itself. Bare trees, late afternoon light going horizontal and golden, everything stripped down to its structural lines. He got back at 4:15. The house was quiet in the mid-afternoon way. Sophie was somewhere with Mrs. Pendleton, the other staff moving on their schedules. He went to the kitchen, made the coffee correctly, and sat at the table. Claire came in at 4:30. She looked at him and at the coffee and said nothing for a moment. How did the board go? Fine. No removal. Fine, she repeated, with the slight skepticism she applied to words that were doing too much work. It went the way it needed to, he said. They were unhappy with the method. They're going to manage the aftermath. She sat down. She looked like someone who had spent the day with her own aftermath. Patricia Cole had spoken with her for 2 hours that morning, going through the documents, recording her formal statement. He could see the residue of it on her, the way a person looks when they've spent time inside something difficult, and the session is over, but the material doesn't leave with the attorney. Cole says 3 weeks, Ethan said. She told me. Claire's hands were flat on the table. 3 weeks. How are you doing with it? She thought about this for a moment. Actually thought about it. Didn't produce an automatic answer. I keep thinking about my first week in the ER, she said. I was 24. I just finished my rotations, and this kid came in. 6 years old, she'd fallen off a trampoline. Her arm was at an angle that arms aren't supposed to be at. And she was screaming, and I knew exactly what to do. Not because I was exceptional. I wasn't exceptional. I was just trained. I'd done the work. I knew the steps. And that knowing, that feeling of, I understand this situation and I know what to do, I had that for 6 years. Mo'om tishai. She paused. And then I didn't have it. And I've been without it for 2 years. And now there's a chance I get it back. She stopped. And that's terrifying, she said, with the honest bewilderment of someone surprised by their own reaction. I expected to feel relieved, and mostly I feel terrified. Because you've been managing without it, Ethan said. You've built something that works without the license. Having it back means I have to become that person again, she said. And I don't know if I'm still her or not. She looked at her hands. 2 years is a long time to be someone else. He understood this in a specific, personal way that he didn't say out loud because this was her conversation, not his. But he understood it. The question of whether you were still the person you'd been before the thing that changed everything, and the complicated truth that you weren't, not entirely, and the further complicated truth that the new version might be capable of things the old version wasn't. You climbed into a burning car, he said. That person is still in there. She looked up at him. The competence doesn't go away, he said. The knowledge doesn't go away. What 2 years of this has done is, he stopped, trying to get it right because he owed it to her to get it right. It's put a lot of weight on top of it. But weight isn't the same as absence. She was quiet for a long moment. Daniel would have said something like that, she said. Not sadly, just honestly. He was better at it than you, no offense. He almost laughed. It came out as something adjacent to a laugh. The surprised exhale of a man rediscovering that his face knew how to do this. None taken. She looked at him with the unguarded quality she occasionally produced when she'd been worn down past the careful neutral. You're not as bad at this as you think you are, she said. The talking to people thing. I'm told I'm very bad at it. You're bad at performing it, she said. You're not bad at doing it when you're not performing? She stood up. There's a difference. She picked up his coffee mug and hers and took them to the sink. Sophie asked me this afternoon when we're doing the shadows again. She said the storm game. I didn't know she knew it was called that. He stared at the table. Rebecca called it that. I didn't know Sophie remembered. She does. Claire set the cups in the sink. She remembers things you might not realize she remembers. She paused at the sink. She's been carrying more than she's been showing. She's good at making herself manageable. He absorbed this quietly. She gets that from you, Claire said, and walked out of the kitchen before he could respond to it. He sat at the table in the late afternoon light, with the coffee gone, and the company slightly diminished and the board temporarily managed and 3 weeks still to go before a license was restored. And he thought about a 6-year-old who had learned to make herself manageable. And he thought about the things she was carrying that she hadn't shown anyone yet. And he thought about the fact that she'd told Claire about the storm game, had named it, had invoked it, which meant she was ready to play it again. He got up and went to find his daughter. She was in the playroom, on the floor, with a flashlight. She had positioned herself near the white wall and was holding the flashlight at arm's length, angled upward, and she was trying to make the fox shape. He could see her working at it, her fingers moving, adjusting, trying to get the ears right. The shadow on the wall was not quite a fox. It was something between a fox and a rabbit and possibly a dog. She was frowning at it with complete concentration. He sat down on the floor beside her. She looked at him. Then she looked at the shadow. It's not right, she said. The ears. Can I try? She handed him the flashlight with the serious gesture of someone delegating an important task. He held it at the angle she'd been using and brought his hands up. He'd watched Rebecca do this 100 times. He'd never done it himself. The shadow on the wall was worse than Sophie's had been. Sophie looked at it critically. That's not a fox, she said. No, he agreed. That's a weird bird. It might be. She took the flashlight back. She held it the way she'd been holding it before and tried the ears again. He watched her fingers work through the problem. The patient, iterative quality of a child who has decided she's going to solve something. She was 6 years old, and she had decided she was going to do the shadow fox, so she was going to do the shadow fox. We'll ask Claire, Sophie said, without looking up from the shadow. She knows how. Yeah, Ethan said. We'll ask Claire. Sophie adjusted her thumb, and suddenly, without warning, the shadow on the wall resolved into something unmistakably fox-shaped. Long muzzle, pointed ears, the right proportion of head to body. She froze, staring at it, as if sudden movement might lose it. Then she flicked her wrist and made the tail move. Ethan watched the foxtail sweep across the wall. "I got it," Sophie said, very quietly. The voice of someone who has been working toward something and has arrived. "You got it," he said. They sat on the playroom floor for 20 minutes, Sophie making the fox move against the wall in its various moods. Alert, curious, the head turn, the tail flick. While the late afternoon light outside went from gold to the particular dark blue of early November evenings, and the house held them the way houses hold things when the people inside them are, finally and imperfectly, beginning to let the walls be walls instead of protection. The letter from the licensing board arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks and 2 days after Patricia Cole had filed the petition. Claire was in the East Garden when it came. She'd started spending mornings there, not because the garden required her attention, that was the groundskeeper's domain, but because the cold November air had a quality she needed, the kind of clean that went into the lungs and reminded you that the body was still operational regardless of what the mind was doing. She'd developed this habit the way she developed most things now, quietly, without planning it, one morning at a time. Mrs. Pendleton came out to find her. She was holding an envelope, and her expression was carefully neutral in the way of someone who knows the contents of something they haven't opened. "This came registered mail," she said. "I signed for it." Claire looked at the envelope. The return address was the State Nursing Board. Her name was typed across the front in the official font of institutional correspondence, the font that had, 2 years ago, delivered the worst document she'd ever received. She took it. She stood in the garden with it for a moment. The letter was thin, 1 page, maybe 2, and she could feel the slight stiffness of the board's letterhead through the envelope, the particular weight of bureaucratic paper. She'd held this envelope before, the other version of it, and she knew that thin envelopes from boards could contain either one short sentence of restoration or one short sentence of denial, and that there was no reading the weight for which one it was. She opened it. She read it once, standing there with the cold air on her face and the bare garden around her and Mrs. Pendleton watching from a careful distance. She read it again. Then she folded it back along its original crease and stood for a moment longer because she needed a moment, and the garden was the right place for it. "Your nursing license has been reinstated effective immediately, with full restoration of your professional standing and the removal of the disciplinary notation from your record. The board wishes to acknowledge that the proceedings of December 2023 were conducted on the basis of testimony subsequently determined to be materially false, and that this reinstatement reflects the board's determination that no professional misconduct occurred." No professional misconduct occurred. 2 years, 370 some odd days, approximately 18 months of cleaning other people's houses, 1 dead fiancé, 1 destroyed career, 1 folder of documents she'd kept because she hadn't known what else to do with them. And the sentence that resolved all of it was 2 lines on a piece of official paper. She didn't cry. She'd expected to cry, and she didn't. What she felt instead was something she didn't have an immediate word for, a kind of profound bone-level tiredness that was different from the exhaustion she'd been living in, because this tiredness was the kind that comes after, not during. The kind that arrives when the thing you've been bracing against finally stops. She went inside. Ethan was in the kitchen tray. He was often in the kitchen now, at the table with his coffee and whatever he was reading, the office on the upper floors becoming less and less his primary location as the weeks had gone by. He looked up when she came in. He saw her face. She put the letter on the table in front of him. He read it. She watched him read it, the way his eyes moved through it, the particular stillness of his face when he reached the second line. He set it down. "Okay," he said. It was such a small word for such a large moment. She'd been in her head for the last 10 minutes composing the different versions of this conversation, all the things she might say or he might say, and what came out of him was okay. And it was, she realized, exactly right. It was the word that didn't try to be more than the moment needed. "I need to call Patricia," she said. She already knows. The board notified her directly this morning. He stood up and got a second mug and poured coffee for her without asking and set it on the table. "She called me at 8. I was waiting for your letter to arrive." Claire sat down. She wrapped her hands around the mug. "You knew." "For about 4 hours." "You didn't say anything." "It wasn't my letter to open," he said. She looked at the coffee. She looked at the letter, still folded on the table between them. She thought about a Tuesday morning 2 years ago. A different letter, a different kitchen, a table in the apartment she'd shared with Daniel where she'd sat for 40 minutes with the board's revocation notice before she could stand up again.
I don't know how to be a nurse again, she said. It came out before she'd decided to say it. I know that sounds strange because I know how to do the work. The clinical knowledge it's still there. I kept up with the literature even after I was reading journals in the evenings for 2 years because I didn't know what else to do with the part of me that was trained for it. She paused. But I don't know how to walk into a hospital and be that person in front of other people.
I've been invisible for 2 years. I don't know how to take up that kind of space again. Ethan sat with this. He didn't rush to fix it or reassure it. This was the thing she'd noticed about him in the slow accumulation of mornings and kitchen conversations over the last month. He'd stopped trying to solve the things that didn't want to be solved. He'd started just sitting with them instead. You will, though, he said finally. Not right away, but you will. How do you know? He looked at her. Because you couldn't stop, he said. Even when they took the license, you couldn't stop being what you are. You read the journals. You kept the folder. He paused. You walked into a burning car. She exhaled. That's a high bar. It establishes the baseline. She almost smiled. The kitchen was warm and the coffee was correct and the letter was on the table, and outside the November garden was gray and bare and entirely real.
I need to find a position, she said. Pediatric ER, if I can. It's what I was trained for, but my record has the notation. Even with the removal, some hospitals are going to see the gap and ask questions. Patricia is handling letters of professional character from 3 sources, Ethan said. 2 former supervisors who've agreed to speak to the quality of your practice, and 1 from the company, from me, personally, not from corporate, that explains the gap in terms of what actually happened. She stared at him. When did you arrange that? 2 weeks ago. I wanted it ready when the letter came. He picked up his coffee. There's also a position at Hudson Valley Children's Medical Center. The pediatric emergency department is expanding. Their chief of nursing is a woman named Dr. Ayanna Reeves. She's aware of your situation and she'd like to speak with you. The silence lasted several seconds. You contacted a hospital, Claire said. I contacted several, he said. Hudson Valley was the one that came back with an actual opening that matched your background. I'm not telling you to take it. I'm telling you the conversation is available if you want it. She looked at him across the table. He was drinking his coffee with the slightly sheepish quality of a man who has done a thing he's not entirely sure he was supposed to do and is waiting to find out. Ethan, she said, I know, I should have... Stop. She held up a hand. I'm not upset. She set down her mug. I just need a minute to catch up to this. He nodded and let her have the minute. She sat with it. The license and the hospital and the letters of character and the 3 weeks of things he'd apparently been arranging while the board petition moved through its process. She thought about what it meant that someone had been doing this for her. Not performing care, actually doing the specific practical work of clearing the ground so she could move. Daniel had done this. He'd shown up when she didn't ask. He'd picked her up from the double shift. He'd just done the thing without making a production of it. She hadn't let anyone do anything for her in 2 years. Thank you, she said. And I mean that properly, not reflexively. He nodded. Call Reeves, he said. See what the conversation is, that's all. She called Dr. Ayanna Reeves that afternoon from the small desk in her room in the staff wing. The desk where she'd kept the folder for 4 months, the document archive she now no longer needed to maintain, the evidence that had served its purpose and could be filed away or shredded or kept as the kind of thing you keep, not because it's useful, but because it marks a period of your life that was real. Dr. Reeves was 52, direct, and had the voice of someone who had been working in pediatric emergency medicine long enough to have stopped treating time as an unlimited resource. She asked Claire 3 clinical questions in the first 5 minutes of the call. Specific, case-based, the kind designed to assess whether 2 years away from practice had created gaps. Claire answered them cleanly and without hesitation, because the knowledge was there, had always been there, had simply been waiting in the part of her that never fully accepted the revocation. I want to be honest with you, Reeves said. Some of my staff know about the situation. The news coverage was substantial. There may be a period of adjustment. I know, Claire said. I'm not expecting it to be easy. I'm not looking for easy, Reeves said. I'm looking for good. You have people who've worked with you who say you're very good. I was, Claire said. And then she corrected herself because the tense mattered. I am. 3 days a week to start, Reeves said. While you recalibrate. We can expand from there. A pause. When can you come in for a formal interview? She said next Monday, and when she hung up, she sat at the small desk for a while with her hands in her lap, looking at the wall where the folder had lived, feeling the shape of things rearranging. She had not allowed herself, in 2 years, to want this specifically. She'd allowed herself the general want, the abstract wish that things were different, but she'd kept the specific want, the actual clinical future, at a distance, because specific wants were the ones that hurt when they didn't materialize. She'd built her life around what was actual rather than what was desired, because what was actual was manageable and what was desired was dangerous. She was going to have to learn how to want things specifically again. This was, she suspected, going to be harder than the board petition. She went to find Sophie. The child was in the conservatory, the same room where this had all begun 6 weeks ago. The glass room with its tropical plants and its cold stone floor and its ceiling that caught light at certain angles and held it. Sophie was at the low table near the east windows, drawing with the focused, total commitment of a person for whom the current task is the entire world. She had a collection of markers arranged by color along the table edge. This was new, the organization of art supplies, something she'd started doing in the last 2 weeks with the careful precision of a child discovering that she had preferences about how her things were arranged. Claire sat on the floor near her. Not at the table. Sophie had a particular relationship with her table space, and adjacency was better than encroachment. Sophie registered her presence and kept drawing. What is it? Claire said, looking at the paper. Sophie turned it slightly so it was more visible from Claire's angle. It was a house, a large house, clearly the estate, with the windows drawn in careful rectangles and the roof with its particular angles. In front of the house was a garden, and in the garden were 3 figures, a tall one, a medium one, a small one. The small one had a fox under its arm. That's us, Sophie said, without looking up, just informing. Claire looked at the 3 figures. The medium one had been given yellow-brown hair, approximating Claire's coloring, with a nurse's attention to getting details right that was slightly startling in a 6-year-old. You put me in the garden, Claire said. You live here, Sophie said. Claire sat with this for a moment. She lived here. Sophie had stated it with the complete simplicity of a child reporting a fact, not asking, not suggesting, just stating the condition as she understood it to exist. I might be starting a new job soon, Claire said carefully, at a hospital. Do you know what that means? Sophie looked up from the drawing. Her dark eyes, Rebecca's eyes, assessed this information. You'd be a nurse again? Yes, Sophie considered. But you'd still come back here? Yes, Claire said. I'd still come back here. Sophie returned to the drawing. She added something to the medium figure, a small object in its hand. It took Claire a moment to identify it as a flashlight. She sat in the conservatory on the cold stone floor while the November light came through the glass walls in its flat, clear way, and she thought about the word here and what it had come to mean. 4 months ago, here had been a temporary structure, the bridge she was using to get from one side to something she hadn't quite been able to picture. She'd been so focused on crossing that she hadn't noticed the bridge becoming load-bearing in a different way. She didn't have language yet for what this was, this house, this child, this man with his bad coffee and his moral reckonings and his way of sitting on the floor in the playroom without needing it to be anything in particular. She didn't have language for it, and she was, for the moment, leaving it without language, because not everything needed to be named before it was real. The winter arrived in the way of this particular valley. Gradually, then suddenly, the way things tended to arrive. December brought snow to the east lawn and the particular silence of a property under fresh cover, the ground stripped back to their most essential lines, the oaks, the stone wall, the far tree line. The house looked different in the snow, less like a fortress and more like what it was, a large building in a landscape, occupied by people working out how to be in it. The first day Claire drove to Hudson Valley Children's Medical Center, Ethan made her coffee in the thermos she kept in the mudroom. Correctly,
at the right setting, and didn't make a production of it. Sophie stood at the window and watched the car go down the drive with the serious, tracking attention of a child who needs to confirm that departures are not permanent. Claire's hand shook slightly on the steering wheel for the first 20 minutes of the drive. She'd expected the hospital to feel foreign, and it did. The smell of it, the particular antiseptic and industrial coffee quality of every medical building she'd ever been in, hit her in the parking garage and turned something over in her chest. She sat in the car for a minute. Just a minute. Then she got out. The pediatric emergency department was on the second floor. She badged in. Her new badge. Her name on it in the font of someone who actually worked there. And the floor was what it always was. Controlled chaos in the manner of a system that has learned to function at capacity. Staff moving with the specific efficiency of people who know that hesitation costs time and time in a pediatric ER costs things that can't be recovered. Dr. Reeves met her at the nurses' station. She was tall, with natural gray locks and the calm of someone who had cultivated it deliberately over decades. "Ready?" Reeves said. "No." "Yes," Claire said. The shift was 8 hours. A 6-year-old with a suspected fracture. A toddler with a fever that had spiked to a level requiring monitoring. A 9-year-old asthmatic in mild distress. A 2-year-old who had, in the creative tradition of 2-year-olds, inserted a small toy component into her left nostril. Between cases, there were charts, consultations with the attending physician, the navigation of a department's social geography, who deferred to whom, which nurse was the unofficial keeper of procedural memory, which aide was reliable under pressure. The 6-year-old with the fracture was scared. He was small for his age, with the particular kind of small that suggested he'd always been small. And he was trying very hard not to cry in the specific way of boys who've been told crying is a performance they shouldn't give. His arm was at an angle Claire had seen before, had described once in a licensing board hearing, had known what to do about since her second year of training. She pulled up a rolling stool to his level. She did not speak immediately. She waited until he'd registered her presence, not as an authority, not as someone who was about to do something to his arm, just as a person who was in the same general situation as him, at the same height, looking at the same wall. "What's your name?" she said. "Marcus," he said. He was 9. He'd told her 9 when she'd checked his intake. "Marcus, I'm Claire." She looked at his arm, then back at his face. "It hurts a lot, right?" He nodded, very slightly, the minimal acknowledgement of someone who has decided minimal is safer. "It's going to hurt less soon," she said. "I'm going to explain everything before I do it. Nothing happens to your arm without me telling you first. Okay?" He looked at her. The particular assessment, calibrating whether she meant it. "Okay," he said. She meant it. She told him everything before she did it, and his arm was set and splinted by an orthopedic resident 40 minutes later. And when she came back to check on him before discharge, he was showing his mother the splint with the proprietary pride of a child who has survived something and received hardware for it. His mother stopped her in the hallway. She was a woman in her mid-30s, tired in the sustained way of parents of multiple children, and she caught Claire's sleeve with the directness of someone who doesn't have time for a longer approach. "He told me you explained everything first," she said. "He said you didn't just do things to him." She paused. "Thank you. He's had some bad experiences in emergency rooms, and I was worried about—" "Thank you." Claire said she was welcome, because there wasn't anything more adequate than that, and went back to the nurses' station and stood for a moment with her chart and felt, for the first time in 2 years, like the ground under her feet was where she'd left it. She called Ethan on her lunch break from the gray stairwell outside the department where hospital workers went to have conversations they didn't want to have in front of patients. "How is it?" he said. "Hard," she said. "Good. Both. Sophie made you something. She wants to give it to you when you get back." "What is it?" "I have no idea. It involves scissors and an unreasonable amount of tape. I've been asked not to look at it." She stood in the stairwell and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, the specific, ordinary warmth of having somewhere to go back to. "I'll be home by 6, she said, and the word home came out before she could select a different one, and she let it stand. December moved into itself. Claire worked Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. The department absorbed her the way good departments absorb competent people. Not without friction, because there is always friction when someone arrives with a history, but with the fundamental pragmatism of a workplace that measures people by what they do under pressure. By her third week, she was the nurse. The attending on Tuesday mornings always seemed to regret wasn't there, which doctor. Reeves told her directly, and which was the kind of feedback that lands differently than formal praise. The federal investigation produced its first results in December. The indictment of Harrison Webb on charges of obstruction of justice and witness tampering was announced on a Wednesday afternoon. David Park entered into a cooperation agreement with investigators, which Ethan's attorney Frank DeLuca described, with the dry precision of a man who'd been in this business a long time, as the move of a man who has correctly assessed his odds. The outside law firm, Aldworth and Foster, faced a separate Bar Association inquiry that would take months, but that Patricia Cole described as likely to result in significant sanctions. Ethan read the indictment documents on a Wednesday evening in the library. He was in the library more now. Rebecca's books still in Rebecca's system, but he'd started actually using the room, sitting in the chair that got the best reading light, occasionally taking down one of her books and reading it because he was curious what she'd found in it. He'd found the bookmark, the grocery receipt from 14 months before the accident, where he'd left it, folded into the trauma recovery book he hadn't been able to read that first night. He'd read the book eventually. It had taken him 2 weeks, a chapter at a time. It was not a perfect book. It had the limitations of its genre and the occasional oversimplification of a text written for general audiences. But Rebecca had marked 2 passages lightly in pencil. She'd marked things in pencil because she'd told him once that books didn't belong to you just because you'd bought them. And he'd read those passages carefully. One of them was about how children who've experienced trauma often need the adults around them to stop trying to move them through it and start being willing to simply be in it alongside them. He'd stared at that passage for a long time. Claire found him in the library that evening. She came in without knocking. They'd moved past the knocking stage at some point. The exact moment unclear. The way most shifts in daily life are unclear until you look back and can't find the specific hinge. She was still in her scrubs, having come directly from the hospital, her coat half off her shoulders, and she took in the room with the quick assessment of someone who reads situations fast. "Bad news?" she said, looking at the documents on his knee. "No, exactly what we needed." He set them aside. Webb was indicted this afternoon. She absorbed this with a small nod. 2 years of waiting for institutional consequence, and here it was in a Wednesday evening document, matter-of-fact and bureaucratic and real. "How does it feel?" "Correct," he said. Not satisfying, exactly. Just correct. She understood this. She sat in the other chair, the one that didn't get the best light, with her coat still half on. "Dr. Reeves asked me this week if I wanted to go full-time in the spring," she said, "when they expand the department." He looked at her. "What did you say?" "I said I needed to think about it." She looked at her hands. 3 days a week works right now. It's enough to feel like myself again without... It leaves space for other things." He didn't ask what other things. He already knew some of them, and the ones he didn't know weren't his to ask. "Sophie told me something yesterday," he said. "What?" "She told me that you're good at being sad," he said. I was asking her about school. She started doing half days at the local school, just to try it. She was telling me about a girl in her class whose parents were fighting a lot, and the girl was sad about it. And Sophie said, "Claire is good at being sad. Maybe the girl should know someone like that." Claire was quiet. "She meant it as a compliment," he said. "I know she did." Her voice had the quality it got when something had gone past the careful surface. "It's the most accurate compliment anyone's ever given me." She'd learned over 2 years of loss that the people who were actually useful when things were terrible were not the people who were good at cheerfulness or silver linings or the performance of optimism. They were the people who could sit in the difficult thing alongside you without needing it to resolve. Daniel had been good at that. It was, she thought, probably the most underrated human capacity, the ability to be present in the bad thing without flinching away from it. "You're not bad at it either," she said, looking at Ethan. Now, he repeated. "You were at first. You kept trying to organize it, make it into a problem with a solution." She said this without cruelty. Just the honest observation of someone who had watched him change. "You're better at sitting with things." "Sophie helped," he said. She's very patient with me. She has her mother's stubbornness, Claire said. She's decided you're going to be okay, so you're going to be okay. She just waits you out. He almost smiled. The genuine version, the one that came without his permission and hadn't come often in 2 years, but was coming more now, slowly, the way things come back when you stop actively preventing them. That is exactly what she does, he said. It was in December, 3 days before Christmas, that they had the conversation they'd been having in fragments since October. The real one. The one about what this was and what happened next. Sophie was asleep. The house was quiet in the way of late evenings when the staff had gone to their respective spaces and the building settled into itself. Claire had been in the conservatory. She went there sometimes in the evenings, for no reason she'd formally identified, though the room had a quality she didn't have a word for. And Ethan had come to find her. He stood in the doorway of the conservatory the way he'd stood there 6 weeks ago, watching his daughter and this woman on the floor with a flashlight, not knowing yet what he was looking at. "We need to talk about what you're going to do," he said. She looked up from the plant she'd been examining, a large-leafed thing that had developed an interesting texture variation she kept meaning to ask the groundskeeper about. "What do you mean, what I'm going to do?" "The staff arrangement." He came into the room and sat on the stone bench along the south wall. "The agency position ends at the end of the year. I've had HR extend it twice without updating the terms, which is—" He paused. "That's not how I want this to work." She straightened up. "What do you want?" He looked at her. "Honestly, that's the only version I'll take." He exhaled. "I want you to stay, not as staff. I mean stay. Sophie needs you, and I—" He stopped, started again with the directness of a man who has learned that circling doesn't serve him. "I need you too. That's real, and I've been pretending it's not, and I don't think it's fair to you to keep pretending." She looked at him for a long time. This was the conversation she'd been half aware of approaching for weeks, the way you're aware of a weather system building at the edge of the forecast, present in the peripheral vision even when you're looking elsewhere. She'd had it with herself in the early mornings in the garden, turning it over with the same systematic care she brought to difficult things. What it was, what it could be, what she was afraid of, and what she wasn't. "I'm afraid of ruining what's actually working," she said. "So am I." "Sophie is stable right now. She's speaking. She's drawing pictures of the three of us in the garden and going to school half days and learning the fox on her own." She folded her hands. That's not a small thing. That's the result of a lot of things coming together in the right order at the right time, and I don't want to introduce something that complicates it. "She drew us in the garden," Ethan said, "together. She's not confused about the arrangement. She's decided about it. Kids do that." "I know." Claire sat on the bench across from him. "I'm not saying I want to leave. I'm saying I'm scared of getting this wrong." "Yeah," he said. "Me too." They sat with that. Two people who had both gotten very wrong things very badly wrong in the recent past, and who understood that fear of repetition was not irrational, and who were also aware that caution taken too far becomes its own kind of damage. "Here's what I think is true," Claire said. "I think I care about Sophie in a way that is real, and not going anywhere, regardless of what else does or doesn't happen. I think this house it's become something I didn't plan for it to be. And I think you're a different person than you were 6 weeks ago. And I'm a different person than I was. And different people than we were is probably where this has to start from." "Okay," he said. "And I think—" She stopped. "I think Daniel would have been furious at me for spending 2 years not letting anything matter." Her voice was careful around it. "He would have had a lot to say about that. He had a lot to say about everything." The ghost of something moved through her face. Not grief exactly, or not only grief. The complicated composite of remembering someone who was funny and specific and gone. "So, that's where I am." "Where you are sounds honest," Ethan said. "Where are you?" He looked at the plants, at the glass walls, at the conservatory ceiling where 6 weeks ago the fox had moved across in shadow. "I spent 2 years thinking that functioning was the same as living," he said. "Keeping the company going, keeping Sophie managed, keeping the schedule. It looked like being okay from the outside. It was not being okay." He paused. I'm not going to tell you I'm okay now. I'm not entirely. I still have bad nights, and I still sometimes sit in the library with Rebecca's books and feel the full weight of it. He met her eyes. But I'm here. Actually, here, in this house, not just running it from behind glass. That's different.
She nodded. Yeah, she said, I know the difference.
They didn't resolve it into a category that evening. They didn't name it or schedule it or assign it formal terms. What they did was sit in the conservatory for another hour, talking about things that were not directly the thing. The hospital, the department, Sophie's progress at school, the book Ethan had found in the library that he thought she might find interesting, the groundskeeper's plan for the East Garden in spring. Ordinary things. The texture of two people getting comfortable being in the same room without anything to manage. It was enough for now. Both of them knew it was enough. Christmas in the house was the first one in 2 years that Ethan actively participated in rather than endured. He put up a tree, badly, because the stand had a wobble he couldn't correct, and eventually gave up trying to correct. And Sophie decorated the bottom third of it with the focused intensity of a child who has strong opinions about ornament placement, and the top third was left slightly sparse because neither adult wanted to make a production of reaching the upper branches. On Christmas morning, Sophie came downstairs at 6:15 and found both of them already in the kitchen, Claire with her tea, Ethan with his coffee. And she walked to the table with her fox under one arm and her flashlight in the other hand, and she set these items on the table and looked at both adults. Storm game, she announced. Outside, the sky was clear and full of winter sun, not a cloud in any direction. There was no storm. There had not been any storm. Claire looked at Ethan.
She's been practicing, Ethan said. I know, Sophie said. I know how to do it now. I want to show you. They went to the conservatory, all three of them, in the early morning Christmas light, with Sophie's flashlight and the stone floor and the white ceiling that held shadows the way it always had. Sophie positioned herself with the seriousness of someone demonstrating a skill. She held the flashlight. She brought her hands up. The fox appeared on the ceiling.
It was good. Better than good? It was clean and recognizable, and she made the ears sit right, and she made the tail flick with the particular snap that Claire had shown her, and she moved it across the ceiling with the confidence of a child who has practiced something until the practice became the thing itself. She looked at them both when she'd finished. Good, she said. Very good, Claire said. Sophie nodded once, satisfied with this. Then she turned to Ethan with the particular expectation of a child who has given a demonstration and now expects one in return. You try, she said. I told you, he said. I can't do the fox. Claire will teach you, Sophie said, with the simplicity of a child for whom this solution was self-evident. Claire looked at Ethan. He looked at her. Hold the flashlight at an angle, she said. Lower than you think. He held the flashlight. He brought his hands up. Other thumb, she said. He adjusted. Now your index finger. The ear's a triangle. Think of it as 3 points. He tried. The shadow on the ceiling was not a fox. It was arguably some kind of animal. It had suggestions of ears. It's getting there, Claire said. It's a disaster, Sophie said, with the blunt honesty of someone who loves you and holds no illusions about your abilities. Claire laughed. A real one. The kind that has no filter between the body and the sound. The kind she hadn't produced unselfconsciously in 2 years. And it came out of her before she could organize it, and it filled the conservatory and went up into the glass ceiling and out into the winter morning. Sophie grinned, the full, unguarded grin of a child who has made an adult laugh and knows it. Ethan looked at both of them. He looked at this room, the conservatory, the glass walls, the winter light, his daughter grinning with her fox tucked under her arm. This woman who had been through fire, literally and otherwise, and who was laughing in his house on a Christmas morning. He thought about the version of himself 6 weeks ago, on page 4 of a quarterly report, in a house that had 43 rooms and felt empty in all of them. He thought about how the shape of things changes, not all at once, not cleanly, not the way narrative wants things to change, not with a single moment of clarity or a speech or a gesture that resolves everything. It changes the way the garden changes in spring. Incrementally, without announcement, one small thing at a time until you look up one day and the landscape is different from what it was. He was not a healed man. He was a man who was healing, which was different. and which required the continued work of being honest about what was broken and patient about what was mending. Sophie was not a healed child. She was a child who had found her voice again and was learning where to put it, which required the freedom to sometimes use it wrong. And Claire was not a healed woman. She was a woman who had reclaimed the professional life that had been stolen from her and was learning, slowly and with difficulty, that reclaiming things was not the same as returning to who you'd been before. All three of them were in the language nobody uses anymore, but that says the thing accurately: works in progress. But here was what was also true. In the cold, clear morning of a winter conservatory, with the shadow fox on the white ceiling and the sound of laughter still moving through the air, the house had 43 rooms, and not one of them felt empty anymore. Ethan adjusted his thumb, the way Claire had shown him, and tried the ears again. The shadow on the ceiling was not a fox, but it was closer. "Better," Sophie said, with the magnanimous generosity of a child who is willing to give credit for effort. "She's being kind," Claire said. "I know," he said. He tried again anyway. Outside, the winter moved over the estate in its steady, indifferent way. Snow on the east lawn, bare oaks at the perimeter, the long stone wall running the length of the property line. The world was proceeding as it always proceeded, without commentary on the specific arrangements of the people inside one lit house. But inside, in the conservatory, a fox moved across a ceiling, and the people who made it were finally finding their way home.